Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back nearly 7 centuries into the cold stone heart of a medieval castle to live a single ordinary day as a servant. If you genuinely enjoy what I do here, you might like and subscribe, but only if you do, because I would far rather you simply rest. And a quiet thank you to the kind soul who suggested this topic, drifting somewhere out there in the dark. You know exactly who you are. A small note before we begin, the channel is now on Spotify as well, and the link is waiting patiently for you down in the description. So go ahead and dim the lights, switch on a fan if you like its soft hush, get comfortable, and pull your blanket up to your chin. Let's pause for a second, here in the warmth of your own safe bed, and let your mind wander backward across the long centuries. Have you ever wondered who lit the fires before the lords woke in those black hours when the whole castle still slept? Have you ever wondered where all the water came from, hauled bucket by bucket from a deep well in the bailey below? Have you ever wondered what they ate from morning to night and whether thick grey pottage could really be eaten every single day? Have you ever wondered how they kept warm with nothing but wooden layers, smoky fires, and the slow heat of crowded bodies? Have you ever wondered where they slept and whether a servant ever had a bed at all or merely a corner of cold floor? And have you ever wondered whether they were ever truly off duty or whether the bell could summon them at any hour of the long night? Hold those gentle questions loosely now and let yourself sink a little deeper, because the centuries are quietly folding back around you. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1320 on a straw pallet in the corner of a great castle in the grey hour before dawn. Beside you lie a coarse woolen tunic, a pair of worn leather shoes, and a stub of tallow candle that smells faintly of mutton fat. Somewhere above you the Lord still sleeps in comfort, and somewhere below the kitchen fires must be lit before he stirs. Good luck. You rise stiffly in the cold, your breath clouding in the dark, and you feel your way along the familiar wall toward the kitchens. So let us begin where every castle day truly began, not with the Lord at all, but with the lowest and busiest soul of them all, the scullion. Now let us turn to the small, unlovely hour before dawn, when the great hall is still dark, and you, the lowest of the household, must wake first. You did not sleep in a bed, of course, for beds belonged to the Lord and his family, and to a handful of senior servants who had earned a mattress and a measure of dignity. You slept on the floor of the hall itself, among the other lesser servants, wrapped in your cloak and whatever blanket you owned, which was usually not much. Beneath you lay the rushes, layers of dried reeds and meadow grasses strewn across the cold stone, the medieval answer to both carpet and mattress. They were not so bad when freshly laid, sweet-smelling and springy, sometimes scattered with herbs like lavender or sweet flag to mask the closeness of so many bodies. But rushes were rarely fresh, for changing them entirely was a labor, and beneath the top layer lay older stuff, trodden flat and quietly accumulating the leavings of the horn. Bones dropped from supper, spilled ale, the crumbs and grease of 100 meals, all settled down into the matting where the brooms seldom reached. So you woke a little stiff, a little itchy, with the print of woven reed marks pressed into your cheek, and the cold of stone risen up through it all into your bones. Spare a thought from the warmth of your own mattress, for the simple miracle of a floor you do not have to sleep upon. There was no clock to wake you, no soft chime beside your pillow, only the habit of the body and perhaps the distant bell of a church or monastery marking the night office. The hours of the night were measured by prayers rather than minutes, and the deep dark office of matins fell long before any sensible person wished to rise. You learn to wake in that thick blackness by feel, by cold, by the faint stirring of others, for a servant who overslept was a servant soon in trouble. And here is a thing worth knowing, which may comfort you on the night you wake at 3 and cannot find sleep again. Medieval people did not always sleep in one long stretch as we are taught we should, but often in 2, a first sleep and a second sleep, divided by a waking hour. In that quiet gap between the sleeps, people lay murmuring, or prayed, or simply turned their thoughts over in the dark before sinking down again into the second rest. So your own broken night, far from being a fault, was once a perfectly ordinary shape for sleep to take, and you are in old and patient company. But for the servant, the second sleep was brief and shallow, for the household stirred early, and the lowest hands were expected up before the first grey light reached the windows. The first task, before anything else, before you had even properly woken, was the fire, for the great hearth must never be allowed to die entirely. You knelt to the banked coals, raked back the ash that had kept them sleeping warm through the night, and breathed life gently into the embers. Matches did not exist, and striking a fresh fire from flint and steel was slow, cold work, so a wise household kept its hearth alive from one day to the next. You fed it slowly, a little kindling, then small wood, coaxing a flame up into the dark, so that the hall might begin, very faintly, to warm. The light it threw was meagre and orange, and it would be a long while yet before the hall felt anything you might honestly call warm. You think nothing of flicking a switch and flooding a room with light, but for you, on that floor, light itself was a thing made slowly by hand. While the fire grew, you began the long business of waking the hall, for the rushes underfoot had to be tidied before the household passed through. You swept the worst of the night's debris toward the door, gathered the foulest of the old rushes where they had gone sour, and straightened what remained. On the days appointed for it, you carried out the old rushes entirely, an unpleasant task, for what came up from the bottom layer was rarely sweet. Then fresh rushes were strewn, cut from the river banks and marshes in their season and dried, the whole hall briefly made green and fragrant again. It is from these floor coverings, some say, that we still speak of a thing being threshold, the threshold, a board to hold the loose rushes in at the door. Whether or not that old story is exactly true, the rushes were real enough, and the daily care of them fell, as such things always did, to the lowest hands. As you worked, the hall around you slowly filled with the small sounds of a house remembering itself, the creak of a door, a cough, a pail set down. Other servants rose from their own patches of floor, folding cloaks, rubbing warmth into stiff fingers, each turning to the task that was theirs by long custom. For the household ran not on wages and hours as yours does, but on roles, fixed and named, each person a small fitted part of a larger working thing. There was the marshal, who governed the hall and its order, and beneath him a descending ladder of hands reaching down at last to you upon the floor. There was the ewerer, who saw to the water and the washing, the basins and the linen towels with which the household kept its hands and face clean. There was the chandler, who made and tended the candles, the costly beeswax for the Lord's table, and the cheaper, smoking tallow for everyone below the salt. There was the paddler, who kept the pantry and the bread, and the butler with his bottles and barrels of ale and wine in the cool of the cellar. And there was the scullion, lower even than most, who scoured the pots and pans and lived half in soot and grease, a role you might know all too well. Each of these had risen, like you, into the cold dark, and each now moved through the half-lit house toward the long day's appointed labor. You, meanwhile, having tended fire and floor, were sent for water, which did not arrive by any pipe, but had to be fetched and carried. The well or the river lay out across the yard, and you went into the raw, early air with your buckets, your breath showing white before your face. The cold of that water reached the bone, and you hauled it back, full and heavy, slopping over your shins to feed the kitchen and the basins of the hall. Think, for a moment, of the tap you turn without thinking, and the warm, clean water that comes at once and asks nothing of your back or your knees. By now the kitchen was waking in earnest. Its great fire roused, the cooks beginning the slow work of the day's pottage and bread. Pottage was the thing that simmered always, a thick stew of oats or barley, peas and beans, and whatever greens or scraps the season allowed. It hung over the fire much of the day, added to and taken from the warm, reliable center of nearly every meal eaten below the high table. You might be given a little of it now in the grey morning, a bowl of yesterday's pottage and a heel of coarse bread to carry you into the work. You ate it standing or crouched by the warmth quickly, for there was no leisurely breakfast for the likes of you, and the day pressed close behind. Then there were the boards and trestles, for the great hall held no fixed long table, but was set up fresh and taken down between the meals. You and another lifted the heavy boards onto their trestles, laid the cloths, and set out the wooden bowls and horn cups for the household's first meal. Above the central salt sat the lord and his kin and honored guests, and below it sat the rest, the seating itself a quiet map of everyone's worth. You served from below the salt, and you ate there too, when at last you ate in the order that the world had long ago decided for you. And all of this, the fire, the floor, the water, the boards, was done before most of the household had so much as opened their eyes. By the time the Lord rose and came down to break his fast, the hall stood warm and ordered, as though it had simply always been so. He would never see the cold floor you woke on, the ash you raked, the buckets you carried, and that unseeing was, in a way, the whole point of your work. For the labor of the lowest was meant to vanish, to become merely the smooth and comfortable surface of someone else's morning. So, when you next wake before your own alarm, in the dark, on something soft, with warmth already in the room and water a step away, remember the rushes. Now let us turn to the question of where you actually sleep. You, who are the lowest of the household, when the long working day has finally folded itself away. You do not, of course, have a chamber, for chambers are for lords and ladies, and the few servants grand enough to be trusted near their persons through the dark. You sleep instead where you work, which is to say upon the floor of the very hall in which you have labored and served and sweated since before the dawn. Picture the hall now, emptied of its noise, the high table cleared, the dogs settling, the great fire banked down to a sullen orange glow. The trestle boards on which supper was laid are lifted from their frames and stacked against the walls, for a medieval table is a thing assembled and disassembled each day. This unstacking of the room is itself part of your labor, the last of it performed when your eyes are already heavy and your feet already aching. And once the boards are away and the benches drawn back, the floor of the hall becomes, quite simply, the dormitory of the lesser folk of the house. The floor beneath you is strewn with rushes, cut sedge and reeds, and meadow grass scattered loose across the stone to soften it and to soak up the day's spillage. These rushes are your mattress, more or less, a thin and yielding layer of dried green things between your bones and the unforgiving stone. In the better houses, the rushes are changed often and sweetened with herbs, but in the careless ones they lie too long, harboring crumbs and bones and worse beneath their surface. You learn to choose your patch of floor with care, for not all of the hall is equal once the candles are snuffed and the cold begins to climb. The place nearest the hearth is the warmest and the most coveted, and so it falls by the unspoken law of the house to those who have served longest. You, if you are new or young or lowly, even among the lowly, take the colder ground further off, near the draughty screen at the hall's lower end. That screen marks the entrance, the place where the doors let in the night air, and the kitchen smells, and the cold leaks under it like slow water. For a blanket you have your own cloak, the same heavy garment you wore all day, now unpinned from your shoulder and drawn close about you on the ground. Perhaps you share it back to back with another servant, for two bodies under one cloak keep a warmth that one body alone cannot. There is no privacy in this arrangement, none whatsoever, and you would not even think to wish for it, having never in your life known such a thing. You sleep among the others as a matter of course. The scullions and the spit boys, the grooms come in from the stable, the maids who scour the pots. The hall by night becomes a single breathing thing, a tangle of cloaks and rushes and the warm animal heat of bodies drawn together against the dark. Above you, the high roof timbers vanish into blackness, and the smoke of the day still hangs there, for the hall is heated by an open fire and has no proper chimney. That smoke escapes more or less through a louvre in the roof, a little slatted lantern of wood that lets the worst of it drift out into the night. So you breathe as you sleep the lingering ghost of every fire and every tallow candle that burned in the hall that long and busy day. And the candles themselves, the cheap ones at least, are tallow, rendered animal fat, which gutters and stinks and gives a greasy yellow light quite unlike clean beeswax. The beeswax candles, sweet-smelling and bright, are kept for the chapel and the Lord's table, and never wasted upon the likes of you, upon the likes of you, upon the floor. When the last of these lights is pinched out, the hall goes truly dark, darker than any darkness you have known in your bright and switch-lit modern world. You who can banish night with a touch upon the wall can scarcely imagine a dark so complete, so total that you cannot see your own hand before your face. In that dark, you do not sleep all the night through in one long stretch, as you have been taught to think is natural and right. You sleep instead in two portions, a first sleep and a second sleep, with a waking hour set quietly between them like a still pool in the night. You drop into your first sleep soon after the light is gone, sinking quickly, for the body that has labored since dawn does not need to be coaxed. Then, a few hours on, you surface, naturally, gently into the deep middle of the night, neither alarmed nor in any hurry to sleep again. This waking watch is a curious and peaceful thing, an hour that belongs to no master, a small unowned country in the middle of the dark. Some lie still and let their thoughts wander, some murmur prayers learned in childhood, some whisper softly to the neighbor stretched out beside them. You might rise, if you are minded, and stir the embers back to a little life, or step out to relieve yourself before the second sleep takes you. And then, your hours spent, You lie down once more and slide gratefully into your second sleep, which carries you on toward the first grey hint of dawn. But your night is not entirely your own, for even here upon the floor the order of the household reaches down and touches you. Someone must keep an ear open for the fire, lest a stray ember leap from the hearth and find the dry rushes that lie scattered all about. Fire is the constant terror of the timber and thatch world, and a hall packed with sleeping bodies and loose dry rushes is a fearful thing should it catch. So the embers are raked together and covered, curfew they call it, from the old French to cover the fire, a nightly ritual of safety. That word survives in your tongue still, curfew, though you use it now for staying indoors and have forgotten it ever meant the covering of a flame. And someone among you too lies near the great door, half servant and half watchman, the household's first thin line against the night without. To sleep across a doorway was no small honor and no small burden, for your sleeping body was, in a sense, the lock upon the house. You wake, when you wake for good, not to any bell of your own choosing, but to the marshal or the usher moving among the rushes, rousing the house. There is no slow morning here, no lingering beneath warm covers, for the fires must be lit and the water fetched before the great folk above have stirred. You rise stiff from the stone, your hip aching where it pressed the floor through the thin and flattened rushes all the cold night long. And your first task is often to undo the very dormitory you slept in, to gather the cloaks, sweep the rushes, and make the hall a hall again. The boards come down once more from the wall and are set upon their frames, and the room that was your bedchamber becomes a dining hall before breakfast. You see now how thin the line was for the lower servant between the place of work and the place of rest, between the day and the night. There was no journey home at evening, no door closing behind you upon a separate private life, for the hall was your labor and your lodging both. And yet there is a strange and gentle companionship in it too, a warmth you should not too quickly pity, for you were never alone in that dark. You slept ringed about by the same faces you had worked beside, breathing the same smoke, sharing the same cloaks, keeping the same fire from harm. The hall held you all, master and servant, under one roof, though the Lord lay soft above and you lay hard below upon the rushes. And in the morning the same hall fed you all again, the high table and the low, the cycle of work and rest turning over with the day. So consider, as you lie now in your own quiet room, with its closing door and its bed lifted clean off the cold of the floor, consider the soft astonishment of a mattress, of a coverlet that is yours alone, of a darkness you may end with the small turning of a switch. The servant on the hall floor knew none of these, and asked for none of them, and slept all the same, gathered warm among his fellows. And so we leave them there for now, wrapped in their cloaks upon the rushes, between the first sleep and the second, while the covered fire keeps its slow red watch. Now let us turn to the very first task of your day, the one that comes before the bread, before the prayers, before the sun itself has bothered to rise over the walls. For you the morning begins not with a clock or a kettle, but with a great mound of grey ash in the middle of the hall, still faintly warm beneath its crust. In a true medieval hall, the fire sat not against a wall, but in the open centre of the floor, a hearth of stone or beaten clay around which the whole household lived. There was no proud chimney drawing the smoke neatly upward, only a small hole or louvre in the roof far overhead through which the worst of it might wander out. And so you, perhaps a scullion or a young servant of the lowest rank, are the ones sent stumbling down in the cold dark to wake it again. You've slept, if you slept at all, on a straw pallet on the floor of that same hall, among the dogs and the other servants, close to where the fire had been. It was no accident that the lowest folk slept nearest the hearth, for the dying warmth of the night's fire was a comfort handed down to those who owned nothing else. You wake in that strange medieval way the histories remember. In the small hours between a first sleep and a second, the household stirring in the deep middle of the night. But this morning there is no second sleep for you, only the cold flagstones underfoot and the smell of last night's smoke still hanging in the rafters. You kneel at the edge of the hearth and feel, with a careful hand, beneath the grey blanket of ash, for the heart of the thing. For a good fire was never truly let out at night, but banked, raked over with its own ashes, so that a few embers might sleep until morning. This banking of the fire was a nightly ritual across the land, and in time a curfew bell would ring to remind whole towns to cover their fires for safety. The word itself, curfew, comes from the old order to cover the fire, couvre-feu, a small daily war against the ever-present danger of flame in a world of wood and straw. So you trust that someone before you did their work, and that somewhere in this cooling grey there still lives one stubborn coal that refused to die. You find it, or you find nothing, and the difference between those two outcomes shapes the whole shape of your morning. If a live coal remains, you treat it like the small miracle it is, sheltering it with cupped hands as though it were a wounded bird. You draw it gently to the surface, away from the smothering ash, and lay beside it the lightest, driest things you have gathered the night before. There is tinder, perhaps a handful of teased dry moss, or scorched linen rag, or the fine, soft fluff of charred cloth kept dry in a little box. You lower your face close to the coal and breathe upon it slow and steady, the way you have been taught, never too hard nor too quick. And the coal answers, brightening from sullen red to clear orange, and a thread of smoke rises, and the tinder catches with a tiny crackle. But if you find no living coal, no warmth at all beneath the ash, then your morning becomes a far longer and lonelier labour. For there were no easy matches in your world, no small box of them by the hearth, no quick scrape to summon flame on demand. Instead you take up the flint and the curved steel, and you strike them together again and again, coaxing a small rain of sparks from the cold iron. It is fiddling, patient work in the dark, your fingers stiff with cold, the sparks falling and dying upon the waiting char. And then at last one spark lands true and catches, a small dull glow spreading through the charred cloth, and you breathe it tenderly into life. Sometimes, when even the flint failed you, you would take an unlit rushlight or a clay pot and go begging fire from a neighbour's hearth. To carry fire from house to house was an old and ordinary thing, a small kindness traded between kitchens, a coal cradled carefully home through the cold. But let us say fortune favoured you, and the banked fire lived, and now a small flame trembles in your tinder on the great hearth. Now comes the slow, careful building of it, for a flame is a delicate creature, and easily smothered by haste or by wood, too heavy and too soon. You feed it first the smallest kindling, fine splinters and dry twigs, laid loosely so the flame may breathe, leaning them together like a litty frame. You shield it from the draughts that wander always through a medieval hall, those cold rivers of air that slip beneath the great doors and the shutters. The hall is full of such draughts, for glass is rare and precious, and many windows are closed only with wooden shutters or thin oiled cloth. As the kindling takes, you add larger sticks than split logs, building patiently outward until the small flame becomes a proper, living fire. The logs you burn were cut and stacked and seasoned long before, for green wood spits and smokes and sulks, while dry wood gives clean and generous heat. In a great household, the gathering and storing of all this fuel was the steady work of many hands across the turning year. There might be wood, and there might be charcoal, and in some regions turf or peat cut from the bogs and dried in long dark bricks. And as the fire at last grows strong and the flames stand tall, the great cold hall begins slowly to remember what warmth feels like. The light of it climbs the smoke-darkened beams and wakes the colors of the hall, the painted cloth upon the walls, the dull gleam of pewter on the shelves. The smoke rises with it, gathering high beneath the roof in a soft grey haze, before it finds the louvre and slips away into the cold morning sky. This was simply how a hall smelled and looked, the rafters black with the patient soot of years, the whole great room seasoned by its fire like an old cask. You will carry that smell upon you all the day, in your clothes and your hair, the deep familiar scent of wood smoke that means home and warmth and morning. And what a thing you have done, though no one will thank you for it, for you have summoned warmth itself out of the dark and the cold. This fire you have woken is the true heart of the household, and around it the whole long day of the castle will now slowly assemble. Soon the cook will want its heat for the great pots of pottage, and the bread and the roasting meats that the high table will expect. Soon the lord and his family will come down to a hall already warm, never knowing or much caring how the warmth was made, or by whose cold hands. For that was the quiet art of good service, that the comfort should simply be there, complete and unremarkable, as though the hall had warmed itself. And through the whole day you would tend this fire as a shepherd tends a flock, feeding it, raking it, never once letting it fall entirely away. To let the whole fire die in the daytime was a small disgrace, a coldness that everyone would feel and no one would forgive. So you learn the moods of it, when it wants air and when it wants wood, when to rake it and when to simply let it breathe. You learn that the fire is a kind of clock and a kind of companion, marking the hours by its hunger and keeping you company in the empty hall. And when at last the long day folds toward night, it falls to someone, perhaps again to you, to perform the gentle undoing of all this work. You rake the glowing coals together into a close heap and draw the cool ash over them like a coverlet drawn over a sleeping child. You bank the fire for the night, hiding its warmth away beneath the ash, trusting it to keep one ember alive in the dark until morning. And so the cycle closes, the same one your hands will open again tomorrow before dawn, kneeling in the coal to wake the sleeping fire once more. And tonight, when you yourself reach to dim a lamp or lower the heat with a single quiet touch, you might think of that cold servant and his patient coal. For warmth once was not a thing you summoned, but a thing you woke slowly and tenderly out of the ashes of the night before. Now let us turn to the well, and to the long, patient, faintly endless business of carrying water, since in a medieval castle nothing whatsoever was piped. You wake in the grey before the cocks have quite finished, because the kitchen wants water, and the kitchen, you will learn, always wants water. There is no tap to turn, no cistern overhead, no clever lead pipe humming in the wall, only the well in the yard and your own 2 arms to bridge the distance. So you take up the yoke, that broad curved beam of wood, shaped to sit across the shoulders, worn smooth and a little dark, where 100 shoulders have rested before yours. It is carved to the curve of the neck, with a shallow hollow for each shoulder, and 2 short chains or ropes hanging down on either side to take the buckets. You settle it across your back, and for a moment before the buckets are hung, it is almost comfortable, almost kind, like a yoke laid on a patient ox. Then you walk out into the cold of the courtyard, where the cobbles are slick with dew and your breath stands in the air like a small grey ghost. The well is sunk deep, the shaft of cut stone going down into the dark earth, with a low wall around it so the unwary do not tumble in by night. Over it hangs a windlass, a simple wooden roller turned by a crank, the rope wound round it and a bucket fastened to the rope's wet, frayed end. You take the crank and let the bucket down, and you hear it descend, knocking softly against the stones, until it strikes the water far below with a hollow, distant splash. Then you wind it up again, slowly, for the full bucket is heavy and the windlass groans, and the rope sheds cold beads of water onto your wrists. The water comes up clouded with a little grit, smelling of stone and earth and the deep cold place it has come from, and you tip it into your waiting pail. You do this twice, once for each bucket, and already the morning has spent some part of you, though the true work has not yet begun. For now you must hang the full buckets on the yoke, one to each side, and stand up beneath them, and feel the whole weight of the water settle onto your bones. A bucket of water is no small thing. It pulls downward with a dull, honest insistence, and 2 of them together make a load that teaches you to walk with care. The yoke spreads that weight across your shoulders so your arms are not torn from their sockets, and you understand, suddenly, why the thing was shaped just so. And yet, spread or not, the load is there, and you carry it, step by measured step, across the yard toward the dark mouth of the kitchen. The trick you learn is in the walking, for if you stride too fast, the water surges and slaps and leaps from the buckets and runs cold down your legs. So you move with a slow, rolling gait, letting the buckets find their own quiet rhythm, swinging gently, almost asleep, on their chains at either side. You learn to feel the water as a living thing on your shoulders, eager to escape, and you learn to coax it home without losing more than a few bright drops. At the kitchen you tip the buckets into the great standing vessel, the cistern of the cooks, a vast wooden tub bound with iron that swallows your labor whole. And the tub, you notice with a small inward sigh, is still not full, for the kitchen of a castle drinks water the way a dry field drinks rain. So you turn around and walk back to the well and lower the bucket and wind it up, and hang the load and walk again and tip it out and turn. This is the shape of the morning, a small pilgrimage made over and over between the well and the kitchen, your footprints worn into the very stones of the yard. For the cooks need water to boil their pottage, that thick, endless cabbage and oat porridge that simmers all day over the fire and feeds the lower hall. They need water to wash the great pots, to scour the trenchers, to rinse the leeks and onions, to scald the boards where the meat is cut. They need water for the bread dough, for the brewing of the small ale that everyone drinks instead of the dubious water itself, and you carry every drop of it. And the kitchen is only the beginning, for the hall above wants water too, in basins for the washing of lordly hands before and after every meal. That is the ewer's care, the servant of the water and the napkins, but it is you, lower still, who carries the water up to fill his bright basins. You haul water for the laundry, where the linens are soaked and beaten and rinsed in steaming tubs, and the washerwomen's arms are red to the elbow. You haul water for the stables, where the great horses drink deep, and the grooms call for more, always more, with that cheerful cruelty of men who do not carry it. You haul water, now and then, all the way up the turning stair to the Lord's chamber, for the rare and luxurious miracle of a warm bath in a wooden tub. That bath alone might take a dozen journeys to the well, each bucket heated at the fire, each climb leaving you a little emptier than the last. And so the well becomes the still center of your day, the place you always return to, like a tired bird returning again and again to the same low branch. You come to know its rope by the feel of it, where it is frayed, where it bites, where a knot has been tied to mend a fraying you remember from before. You come to know the windlass by its complaints, the particular groan it makes on a full bucket, the lighter chatter as the empty one drops away. In summer the well is a blessing, its water cool and sweet against the dust and the heat, and you linger a moment in its shade before the next load. In winter it is another matter, for the windlass freezes, the rope stiffens like a dead branch, and ice rims the bucket and the low wall of the well. Then the water you haul seems to grow heavier with the cold, and it slops and freezes on the cobbles, and you walk the well's path on glassy, treacherous stone. Your hands crack, your shoulders ache, where the yoke rests, and you wrap them in rags against the rubbing, and you go on, because the water does not fetch itself. By the day's end, the shape of the yoke is pressed into your shoulders, two pale grooves that fade by morning and return again, faithful as the sunrise. You measure your labor not in hours, for you have no clock, but in journeys, in buckets, in the slow filling of tubs that empty again before your eyes. And there is, beneath the ache, a strange and quiet rhythm to it all, the lowering and the winding and the lifting, and the long slow walk and the tipping out. You fall into that rhythm the way you might fall into a tune, your body knowing the way while your mind wanders far off into its own dim country. Sometimes another water carrier walks the path beside you, and you fall into step, two yoked figures swinging in time, sharing the burden of the silence. You speak little, for the carrying steals the breath, but there is a kind of fellowship in it, the unspoken kinship of those who share the same dull labor. And the water you carry touches every life within those walls, though almost no one ever thinks of the arms that brought it from the dark. The Lord washes his hands in it and never wonders. The cook curses when the tub runs low, and never asks how it was filled in the first place. You are the quiet artery of the household, the unseen current that keeps the great stone body of the castle alive, one bucket, one journey at a time. When at last the light fails and the kitchen fire is banked low, the buckets hang empty on their pegs, and the well stands quiet under the rising moon. Your shoulders throb in the dark of your pallet, your palms are rough as bark, and the smell of cold stone and well water clings faintly to your skin. And as you drift toward your own first sleep, the well rhythm still rocks gently in your bones, the rope, the crank, the lift, the long and patient walk. So consider, as you lie warm beneath your blankets, the simple miracle hidden in the wall beside you, the pipe that brings the water silently to your hand. No yoke waits for your shoulders, no windlass groans for you in the frozen dark, No long cold path lies between you and a single cup of water. The water that ran through a medieval day was carried, every drop of it, on patient human backs, and somewhere a tired servant once walked it home for you. Let that thought settle over you, soft and heavy as a full bucket set gently down, and rest now, for the well is far away, and the walking is long done. Now let us turn, you and I, to the great kitchen of the castle, that vast, smoke-stained chamber where so much of your waking life as a servant would be spent. You would know it, even blindfolded, by the heat that reaches out to greet you before your foot has crossed the worn stone threshold. For the kitchen in a great household was rarely a small room tucked beside a parlor, but a building almost unto itself, broad and high and humming with labor. In the larger castles it stood a little apart from the hall, joined by a covered passage, so that its fires might roar without setting the whole place ablaze. This was no idle caution, for fire was the kitchen's whole purpose, and also its constant, patient threat, never quite tamed and never quite trusted. Picture the central hearth, an open fire of logs and glowing embers, wide enough that a grown man might lie down within it, had he the wish and the foolishness. Above it, in the grandest kitchens, the roof rose into a great louvered vent, a wooden lantern through which the smoke was meant, more or less, to escape. More or less, I say, because the smoke had its own opinions, and on a still grey day it would hang about the rafters like a guest, unwilling to leave. You would learn soon enough to breathe in lower air, to stoop and to keep your work near the floor where the haze was thinnest. The walls and beams above you wore a black and glossy coat of soot, laid down by generations of fires long before your grandmother was born. That soot had a smell all its own, woody and sweetish and faintly bitter, and it would cling to your hair and your wool long after you went to your bed. At the heart of the labor stood the spit, a long iron bar set on uprights before the fire, on which the meat for the high table slowly turned. And turning that spit was a duty in itself, given often to a boy, the turnbrush, who sat beside the blaze for hours with a screen of woven straw at his back. That screen of straw or wet sacking was no luxury but a mercy, for without it the heat would scorch his face and roast him near as brown as the dinner. He would baste the meat with a long-handled spoon, ladling back the fat that dripped and hissed and spat into the dripping pan beneath. Nothing was wasted, you understand, for that dripping was saved and skimmed and used again, in a household where waste was something close to sin. Beside the open fire, built into the thickness of the wall, you might find a great domed oven of brick, fired for the baking of bread. The way of it was older than the castle itself, for you would burn a fire inside the oven until the very bricks glowed and held the heat. Then you would rake the embers out, sweep the floor with a damp cloth on a pole, and slide the loaves in upon a long wooden peel to bake in the stored warmth. The bread came in many ranks, as did the people, with fine pale manchets for the Lord and coarse dark loaves of rye and barley for the rest of you. And ever, in some corner of the kitchen, a great cauldron hung from an iron crane, swung in over the fire and out again on its pivot. In that cauldron simmered the pottage, the thick everyday stew of oats and peas and beans and whatever herbs and scraps the day had offered up. Pottage was the true bread of the poor, the meal you would eat far more often than roast meat, ladled warm into a wooden bowl at the day's quiet end. The heat near that fire, you must understand, was a living thing, a wall you walked into, a hand laid flat and firm against your reddened cheek. In high summer, it became a kind of torment, the kitchen folks sweating through their linen while the rest of the castle dozed in shaded cool. In deep winter, of course, it was the warmest place in all the castle, and many a shivering servant found a reason to pass through and linger. The noise of it would surprise you, for a great kitchen was never silent, never still, never anything you could rightly call restful. There was the crackle and roar of the logs, the hiss of fat, the dull thud of the cleaver, the scrape of the ladle round the cauldron's iron belly. There was the cook bellowing his orders, for the master cook was a man of rank and temper, lord of this hot little kingdom of smoke and steam. Under him served a host of others, each to a station in an order as fixed and careful as the seating in the hall above. There were the pages and the scullions, the lowest of all, who scrubbed the pots and fetched the water and slept, more often than not, on the kitchen floor. Theirs was the unromantic war against grease and ash, fought with sand and ashes and cold water, and bare reddened hands that never quite came clean. There was the saucer who tended the sauces, the pottager who watched the pottage, the larderer who guarded the salted meat in the cool dark of the larder. For the larder lay always on the cooler side, away from the fire, a place of stone shells and brine tubs where the precious meat was kept from spoiling. Salt, you see, was the great preserver, dear and carefully measured, rubbed into flesh that must last the household through the lean and hungry months. Smoke, too, did its quiet work, and you might see hams and sides of bacon hung high in the rafters, where the fire's haze would cure them slowly. So the very smoke that stung your eyes and blackened your lungs was also, in its way, a labourer beside you, keeping the winter meat from rot. Water for all this came not from any tap, as it comes to you now with a careless turn of the wrist, but was carried in by hand, bucket after weary bucket. From the well in the courtyard, or the cistern, the water-bearers hauled their loads, and a careless splash upon the hot stones would vanish in a hiss of steam. Light, in the daytime, came from high small windows set above the smoke, and from the great red glow of the fire itself when the sun had gone. After dark you worked by firelight and by rushlights, those humble little reeds dipped in animal fat that burned with a low, smoky and uncertain flame. Beeswax candles, clean and sweet and costly, were for the chapel and the high table, never for the likes of you sweating among the cauldrons. Knives there were in plenty, of every size, kept keen upon a whetstone, for cutting and jointing, and the endless patient chopping of roots and herbs. And mortars of stone or bronze stood ready, in which the spices were pounded, those rare and guarded treasures locked away when not in use. For pepper and ginger and the like came from impossibly far away, dearer than you could dream, measured out by the cook as a miser counts his coin. You, the lesser servant, might go your whole life and taste those spices only in the faint warmth that lingered on a pot you scraped clean. The floor beneath your feet was stone or beaten earth, strewn perhaps with rushes, slippery with spilled fat and grease, and the day's wet labour. You learned to step with care, for a fall by the fire was no small matter, and the kitchen knew well enough how cruelly its own heat could bite. By the day's slow end you were greased and grimmed and aching, your eyes red from the smoke, your back bent from the lifting and the stooping low. And yet there was a strange and ember-warm contentment in it too, a belonging, for the kitchen was the one room that never truly went cold. When the great feasts came round, the whole place became a roaring furnace of effort, with 3 or 4 fires burning at once and no man idle. Then the smoke rolled thick as fog. The heat pressed close as a held breath, and the cooks roared and the boys ran, and the spits never ceased to turn. But on the quieter nights, when the Lord had dined and the embers settled low, the kitchen breathed out and grew almost gentle in the dimming light. The last scullion would bank the fire, raking the embers together and covering them with ash, that a little warmth might be kept alive till dawn. For to let the fire die wholly was a small disaster, a morning of cold flint and patience striking before any breakfast could be coaxed to boil. So the fire was tended like a sleeping child, never quite left, never quite woken, kept low and breathing through the long and quiet hours of the dark. And as you settle now beneath your own warm covers, spare a thought for those who fed the castle, sweating in the smoke so that others might eat in the light. Now let us turn to the scullion, the lowest of the low in the great household, the small soul who scoured the pots while the rest of the world slept on. You would find him, if you went looking, in the scullery, that cramped back room off the kitchen where the dirty work was kept decently out of sight. The word itself comes down to us from the old French escuar, a swab or a dishcloth, and so the boy was named, quite simply, after the rag he carried. You wake, most likely, to a quiet house and a kettle that boils itself, but the scullion woke before the cock to a cold grey hearth waiting to be coaxed back to life. His first labour of the morning was the fire, for nothing in that kitchen could begin until the embers were raked, fed with kindling, and persuaded into flame. You may strike a light without a thought, but he carried the banked coals of yesterday in a clay pot, breathing on them as though they were a living thing. Once the fire was up, the grey cauldrons of water had to be hauled and hung, for there was always water to heat, and always more pots than hands to wash them. You should picture the scullery as a place of grease and steam and endless scrubbing, where the day was measured not in hours but in pots returned to their pecks. The cooking vessels of that age were no easy things to clean, being cast iron and copper and bronze, blackened on the outside and crusted within from the day's pottage. He had no soap as you would know it, but reached instead for sand and grit and the rough stalks of horsetail that bristled weed the old cleaners called scouring rush. You squeeze a bright liquid from a bottle, but he scrubbed with wood ash lye and fine grit, working the metal until the grease gave way and the surface dully shone. The pots came to him in waves, for the kitchen was never still, and each dish carried up to the hall came back down to be scoured before it could be used again. You might think a single washing up a chore, yet his was a household that might feed scores of mouths, and every mouth meant more vessels for the boy below. Between the pots, there were the birds, for a castle kitchen turned through a great many fowl, and someone had to make them ready for the fire. So you would find him seated with a hen across his knees, plucking handful after handful of feathers, until his fingers were sore and the floor lay soft with down. The plucking was warm work and patient work, done while the bird was still fresh, for the feathers loosed more easily then, and the skin tore less under his thumbs. You should know that nothing of the bird was wasted, and even the feathers were gathered up, the finest saved to stuff cushions and bolsters for those who slept above. The larger quills found their way to the clerks and the chaplain, who trimmed them into pens so that the boy's plucked goose became, in time, somebody's careful letter. After the plucking came the singeing, the holding of the bird over the flame to burn away the last fine hairs that the fingers could not catch. You would have smelled that scullery long before you saw it. The singed feather and the tallow and the sour reek of grease soaked deep into the stone. Then came the gutting and the drawing, the careful work of opening the bird and saving the heart, the liver, the gizzard, which the cooks would not let go to waste. You buy your supper trimmed and clean in a tray, but he met it whole and feathered and made it ready with his own raw and reddened hands. There were fish, too, on the many days the church set aside for fasting. And fish meant scaling and gutting and the silver mess that came with them. You should remember how many days of the year were meatless then, the Fridays and the Saturdays and the long weeks of Lent, when the scullion's hands smelled only of fish. He scrubbed the cutting boards and the trestles. He swept the rushes that caught the fallen scraps, and he carried the slops out to the waiting pigs. You set out a bin and forget it, but in his world little was thrown away, and the kitchen's leavings fed the swine that would one day feed the hall. The ashes from the hearth were saved as well, raked out and kept, for from wood ash came the lye that made the very soap and the very scouring he worked with. You might call his a life of circles, the bird plucked to feather the bed, the ash saved to clean the pot, nothing begun that did not return. He answered to the cook, and the cook answered to the kitchen clerk, and so a great chain of order ran upward from the boy in the steam to the Lord above. You should not imagine him idle for a moment, for the cook's word was law, and a scullion who let the fire die or the water cool felt the rough side of that word. His wages, if he had them at all, were small, often little more than his keep, a place by the warm hearth and the broken scraps of the kitchen's plenty. You sleep apart in your own quiet room, but he most likely slept where he worked, curled on the kitchen floor among the donks for the last of the heat. The warmth of that hearth was the one true comfort of his station, for the scullery boy, lowest of all, at least, slept where the fire never wholly went out. You should know that his was a young face more often than not, for the scullion was frequently a boy, taken into service to learn the long ladder of the kitchen. For the work was a beginning as much as a burden, and a scullion who scoured well might rise in time to turn broach, to parcellor, even one day to cook. You might pity him, and you would not be wrong, yet his place was a foothold, a way into the great household for a child who had little else. The turn-broach, a rung above him, stood at the great fire turning the spit, and the scullion watched that hotter, prouder labour and waited for his turn. You should picture the whole kitchen as a small kingdom of heat and noise, the cooks shouting, the spits turning, the steam rising, and the scullion at the very floor of it. He fetched and he carried, he drew water from the well and bore it in heavy yokes, and his shoulders learned young the weight that water can be. You turn a tap and the water comes, but every drop in that kitchen was carried by hand, and much of that carrying fell to the smallest pair of arms. The scouring of the pots went on by firelight, long after the hall had risen from its supper, and the great folk had gone up to their beds. You should imagine the quiet then, the hall above gone still, and only the slop of water and the scrape of sand sounding in the warm dark below. He had a single rushlight to see by, a length of dried reed dipped in mutton fat that burned with a small and smoky and faithful little flame. You flick a switch, but his light was a peeled rush soaked in kitchen grease, the cheapest flame in the castle, fit for the cheapest of its servants. When at last the pots were hung and the boards were scrubbed and the fire was banked low for the morning, his long day folded quietly into sleep. You should know that he, like everyone of his age, slept the broken sleep of his time, a first sleep, and then a waking, and then a second sleep before dawn. In the quiet hour between those two sleeps, he might lie listening to the settling of the fire and think his own small thoughts in the warm and grease-soft dark. You carry your own cares to bed, and so did he. The worry of the cold hearth waiting and the long wash to come, the small dreads of a small life. And yet there was a roof above him, and bread, and the heat of the embers, which in that hard age was no little thing for a boy with nothing. You should spare him a kindly thought, this nameless scrubber of pots, who never sat at the table he served, and never tasted the best of what he plucked. For the scullion left no name behind him, no record, no line in any book, only the worn smooth handles of the pots, his small hands turned 1,000 times. You may think the great hall the heart of the castle, but the kitchen was its true and tireless engine, and the scullion was the smallest wheel that kept it turning. He scoured so that the cooks could cook, and plucked so that the lords could feast, and his labour, though never thanked, ran beneath every meal that house ever ate. You will not find him in the chronicles among the kings and the battles, and yet without him and his like, the whole proud household would have starved or sickened. So let us leave him there, the scullion, asleep at last by his banked and faithful fire, the pots clean, the birds plucked, the long day quietly done. And let us carry his small forgotten labour gently into the dark, grateful, as we drift for the warm and easy comfort of our own untroubled beds. Now let us turn to the smallest worker in the whole great household, the child who sits beside the kitchen fire and does almost nothing but turn a handle for hours. You may picture the medieval kitchen as a cheerful place, but it was, in truth, a roaring cavern of heat, smoke, and ceaseless small labours that no one wished to do. At the centre of it all blazed the hearth, a fire so large that whole carcasses might roast before it, and someone, always, had to keep that meat turning. The meat hung upon a spit, which was simply a long iron rod run through the joint from end to end, balanced upon two upright iron supports. If the spit stood still, the side facing the fire would blacken and burn, while the side turned away stayed raw and pale and useless. So the spit had to revolve slowly and steadily and without pause for as long as the great joint took to cook, which was very long indeed. And the one who turned it, in countless kitchens across the centuries, was a child, the youngest and the least of all the kitchen folk. You might know this small servant by the plain name the kitchens gave them, the turnspit, for that was the whole of the task and the whole of the title. The work was simple to describe and brutal to perform, for it asked nothing of the mind and everything of the patient, aching body. Imagine sitting so near a fire large enough to roast an ox, close enough that the heat scorched one cheek while the other felt the kitchen's draught. You would feel the flames upon your face like a slow midday sun that never set and never softened and never let you turn away. The fat from the roasting meat dripped down and spat and hissed in the embers, sending up little flares and a smell that filled the whole kitchen. And there you would sit, turning, the iron handle warm and then hot beneath your small and reddened hand. The spit could not be rushed, for meat hurried over a fire, chars without and stays raw within, and the cook would not forgive a ruined joint. Nor could the spit be slowed or stopped, for a moment's rest meant to scorch side and the beating, and so the rhythm could not break. You would learn the pace by feel, the slow, steady quarter turn that kept every face of the meat passing evenly through the heat. Hours might pass this way, the great joints of beef or mutton or venison taking the better part of an afternoon to cook through. And in a castle preparing a feast, there might be several spits at once, each with its own small turners sweating before the flames. To shield the worst of the heat, the kitchens often hung a screen of wet straw or a soaked cloth between the child and the fire. Some turnspits held a wet rag or a bundle of soaked hay against the cheek that faced the flames, a small mercy in a merciless place. Still the heat found its way through, and the turnspit's face grew flushed and dry, and the eyes stung from the smoke and the glare. You would carry the smell of roasting fat and wood smoke in your hair and your clothes, so deep that no washing could wholly remove it. The position, you will not be surprised to hear, sat at the very bottom of the kitchen's careful order of rank. Above the turnspit stood the scullion, who scrubbed the pots and hauled the water and the wood, and even the scullion looked down upon the spit-turner. For the turnspit was often a very young child indeed, sometimes barely old enough to be trusted near the fire at all. It was the first rung of the kitchen ladder, the task given to the new and the small before they could be trusted with knives or pots or fire of their own. And yet, humble as it was, the work was real and necessary, for without it the Lord's roast would be ruined and the feast disgraced. So the turnspit child sat at the lowest place and did a thing upon which the whole grand dinner secretly depended. You may wonder what filled the long, hot hours of such a task, when the hands moved but the mind had nowhere to go. There was the fire to watch, the slow miracle of the meat browning, the embers shifting and settling and glowing their deep red. There was the bustle of the kitchen all around, the chopping and stirring and shouting, the great pots steaming over their own smaller fires. There was the chance, now and then, of a dropped scrap, a burnt edge of meat, or a crust of bread slipped quietly into a small, grateful hand. And there was the slow, drowsy weight of the heat itself, which made the eyelids heavy and the head nod even as the hand kept turning. But to sleep was the one thing forbidden, for a spit untended even briefly meant ruin, and so the child fought the warmth and the weariness. You can perhaps feel, even now, the particular cruelty of being made drowsy by the very heat that you are forbidden to rest beside. In time, the kitchens of the wealthier houses sought ways to spare the child, or perhaps merely to spare themselves the cost of feeding one. There came the smoke jack, a clever device set in the chimney, a small vane of metal that the rising hot air turned as it climbed. The hot air rushing up the flue spun the vane, and the vane, through a chain and a gear, turned the spit below all on its own. It was a marvel of its kind, a fire that cooked its own dinner, and where it was fitted, the turnspit child was no longer needed at the handle. But the smoke jack was costly and clever and rare, and in the great age of the castle kitchen it was the child, far more often, who turned the wheel. Much later, in grander kitchens of a later age, even a small dog would be set to the work, trotting within a wooden wheel to turn the spit. But in the world we are walking through tonight, the medieval castle and its candlelit centuries, the turner was nearly always a human child. And so the child sat on, through the short cold days of winter, when the fire was at least a comfort against the chill, and through the long hot days of summer, when the fire was a torment, and the kitchen a furnace, and every other soul kept their distance. You would come to know the great hearth as a creature of moods, fierce when newly fed, gentle when sinking, demanding always to be watched. and you would come to know the meat itself, the way a goose roasts faster than a haunch of beef, the way fat skin crisps and crackles. In this small, hot education, the turnspit learned the kitchen's ways, and the patient child often rose in time to scullion and beyond. For the spit was a beginning and not an end, the lowest door through which a kitchen life might slowly, hopefully rise. Yet for the child sitting there now, in the heat and the smoke and the endless turning, the rising was a distant and uncertain dream. There was only the handle warm in the hand, and the meat slowly browning, and the hours stretching on toward the Lord's distant supper. And when at last the great joint was done, golden and dripping and crackling, it was carried away to the hall where the child would never sit. The turnspit ate, if at all, the scraps and the broken meats, and slept, when sleep came, on a bench or the warm kitchen floor near the dying fire. And so, having turned the spit through all the long bright hours, the child at last lay down to rest in the warm and quiet dark. So when you next sit warm before a stove that needs no turning, the meat browning of its own accord while you do nothing at all, remember the turnspit. Remember the small servant who sat at the lowest place beside the greatest fire, and turned so that others might dine. And feel, as your own eyes grow heavy, a little of the drowsy warmth that long ago child fought so hard against, and which you are free to surrender to now. Now let us turn to the curious machinery of the household itself, the great invisible engine that kept a medieval castle warm, fed, and faintly civilized through the long dark of the year. You might imagine a castle as a single great hall full of knights, but in truth it was a small town of people, each with a place and a duty pressed firmly upon them. And like any small town, it had its order, its ranks, its quiet understanding of who might speak to whom, and who must simply bow the head and pass. Picture yourself entering that world as a boy or girl of perhaps 10 or 12, sent from a tenant family to serve, your whole life rearranged in a single morning. At the very bottom of this order, lower than the dogs by the fire, you would likely begin as a scullion, the least and youngest of the kitchen folk. Your hours would be spent scouring pots, hauling water, plucking fowl, and turning the heavy spit before a fire so fierce it scorched your face by noon. You would sleep where you could, on a sack of rushes near that same warm hearth, grateful at least that the kitchen never wholly grew cold. Above you, though only a little, stood the cooks and their helpers, the ewerer who fetched and warmed the washing water, and the saucer who ground spices to a fragrant dust. Spices, you must understand, were treasures locked away under key. Pepper and cinnamon and ginger counted out like coins, never spilled, never wasted. Higher still came the pantler, who kept the pantry of bread, and the butler, whose name comes from the bottles and butts of wine and ale he guarded. The butler held the keys to the buttery in the cellar, and in a thirsty age those keys made him a man of no small consequence. There was the chandler too, who made and tended the candles, knowing the difference between cheap tallow that smoked and stank and precious beeswax kept for the Lord's own table. You would learn quickly that tallow candles were for the kitchens and the corridors, while beeswax, clean and sweet, burned only where the great folk dined or prayed. The marshal ruled the stables and the horses, a rank far prouder than it sounds, for a castle without sound horses was a castle half blind and wholly slow. Under him came grooms and farriers, and the boys who mucked the stalls, their world the warm animal smell of leather, hay, and patient beasts. In the hall itself moved the ushers and the servers, the carvers who sliced the meat with practiced grace, and the cupbearers who never let a goblet stand empty. Each of these had learned their craft as you were learning yours, by years of watching, fetching, failing, and being corrected with a sharp word and sometimes a sharper hand. For there was no school for this, only the long apprenticeship of the household, where a child rose slowly through the ranks as the years quietly wore away. Now and then you might rise from scullion to kitchen boy, from kitchen boy to server, each small promotion a triumph spoken of for weeks in the lower rooms. And above all this ordered crowd, above cook and butler and marshal alike, stood one figure whose word moved the whole machine, the steward. The steward, sometimes called the seneschal in the grander houses, was the lord's right hand, the man who ran the castle when the lord was away, which was often. For the lord was frequently abroad, at war, at court, at the king's side, or simply riding between his scattered manors, eating one estate empty before moving to the next. In his absence the steward was the castle, his authority near total, his eye expected to fall upon every barrel, every loaf, every lazy soul who thought himself unwatched. He kept the accounts upon long rolls of parchment, every candle, every cask of ale, every sack of flour set down in a patient column of figures. For a great household devoured astonishing quantities, and it fell to him to see that nothing was stolen, nothing spoiled, and nothing quietly vanished into a servant's sleeve. He hired and dismissed the lower servants, settled their quarrels, paid their meagre wages, and decided who ate white bread and who may do with the coarser dark. To stand before the steward in fault was a thing dreaded across the whole household, for his displeasure could cost you your place, your bed, and your daily bread at once. Yet a wise steward was no mere tyrant, for he knew the household ran on order and on a kind of rough fairness, and a starved servant served badly. He held the great keys of the castle upon a heavy ring at his waist, and the very sound of their jingling along a passage made the careless suddenly diligent. Beneath the steward worked other officers of weight, the chamberlain who governed the private rooms and saw to the comfort of the lord's own chamber. The chamberlain controlled who might enter the lord's presence, and so, though he served, he too held a quiet power that the ambitious learned to court. There was the wardrober, who kept the cloth and the clothing, the rich furs and fine linens folded away in great chests against moth and damp. And in the chapel served the chaplain and his clerks, who not only prayed but often kept the writing and the reckoning, for letters were rare and precious skills. You begin to see, perhaps, that the castle was a ladder, and that every soul upon it knew exactly which rung was theirs and which lay forever out of reach. Your place was marked in 100 small ways, in where you sat at meals, in the cloth you wore, in whether you were served or did the serving. There was a famous saying about sitting above or below the salt. The great cellar of salt set upon the high table marking the boundary of consequence. Sit above the salt, and you were a person of standing. Sit below, and you ate the same supper, knowing precisely your modest worth. Wages, when they came, were small, but a servant's true payment was the place itself, the food, the fire, the roof, the belonging to a great name. To be cast out, to lose your place, was to lose almost everything at once, for outside the castle walls lay only hunger and the cold indifference of the road. And so the household held together, each rank leaning upon the one above, each duty fitting the next like the stones of an arch that hold by mutual pressing. The lower servants rose before light to lay fires and draw water, so that when the great folk woke, the castle already breathed warm and ready around them. You would carry wood until your arms ached, sweep the rushes from the hall floor, and scatter fresh ones with sweet herbs to mask the smells of many bodies and dogs. The rushes underfoot would change less often than we might wish, and beneath the fresh green there often lay a darker, older, and frankly unspeakable layer. But you would scarcely notice, for your nose, like everyone's, had long since made its peace with the honest smells of a crowded medieval life. Through all of it the steward watched and tallied, and once a year, sometimes more, he rendered his accounts to the Lord, sweating quietly over every farthing unexplained. A clever steward could grow modestly rich and respected, trusted with lands and decisions, almost a lord himself in the eyes of those beneath him. A foolish or grasping one, caught with his hand in the accounts, could fall as far as he had risen, and the household would whisper of it for years. But most simply did their work, year upon year, keeping the great machine turning, unremembered now, their names dissolved into the patient dust of the rolls. Consider how strange it is that we know the names of kings and forget the steward who fed their armies, the cook who warmed their halls, the boy who turned their spit. Yet that boy by the fire, half asleep over his weary spit, was as real as you are now, with aching arms and a quiet wish for rest. He too longed for the dark to come, for the work to cease, for that blessed hour when the household at last lay down across the floors and the stairs. For in those nights the whole castle slept much as you might, save that many woke in the deep middle hours for a quiet wakeful spell between first and second sleep. In that gentle gap they might tend a fire, murmur a prayer, exchange a soft word in the dark, then sink down again into the second and deeper sleep. And above them, somewhere in the great quiet, the steward too, at last set down his keys, his rolls, his endless reckonings, and allowed himself to rest. So the whole ordered world of the household, from scullion to seneschal, drifted together into the same forgiving darkness, each rank for a few hours made equal by sleep. You may carry that thought gently with you now, of all those careful, weary, unremembered hands that kept the old stone world turning while their masters slept. And you may feel, perhaps, a small and pleasant kinship with them, lying as you are in your own warm bed, your own day's work at last laid down. Now let us turn to the small kingdoms within the kingdom, the little dominions that quietly governed your hours, your bread, your washing water, and the very light by which you found your bed. For though one lord ruled the castle, you did not truly serve him directly, but answered instead to a ladder of officers, each a master of his own narrow trade. Imagine the household not as a single household, but as a clutch of small offices, each with its own keys, its own stores, its own pride, and its own quiet quarrels. At the head of much of this stood the chamberlain, the man who kept the Lord's private chamber, his clothing, his coffers, and the soft secrets of his sleep. You would see the chamberlain rarely, for he moved in the upper rooms where you were not asked to go, and he carried himself like a man who knew it. It was his task to dress the Lord and to undress him, to warm the linens, to draw the bed curtains, and to guard the door against the cold and the curious. He kept the wardrobe too, which in those days meant not a cupboard, but a whole department of cloth, furs, jewels, and careful accounts of every thread. Picture him moving among bolts of wool and rolled tapestry, counting, brushing, mending, and noting the small expenses that a great house quietly devours. And when the Lord lay down to his first sleep, that older two-part rest the people then kept, it was the chamberlain who saw the chamber settled and still. You, meanwhile, answered to humbler masters, and the first of them, out in the noise and straw of the courtyard, was the marshal of the hall. Now the marshal's name comes from the old word for horse servant, and horses remained his first and most jealous concern, the beating engine of the whole estate. He ruled the stables, the grooms, the farriers, the harness, the carts, and the long sweating business of keeping a castle able to move and to ride. But the marshal's dominion crept indoors as well, for in the great hall he kept order, arranged the seating, and saw that no man sat above his proper place. To be seated below the great salt cellar or above it was no small matter, and it was the marshal who quietly settled where each soul belonged. He carried a rod or a staff of office, and when he raised it, the hall grew calmer, the way a room calms now when someone clears their throat. Beneath him swarmed the ushers and the grooms of the hall, who fetched, carried, swept the rushes, and answered to his eye for any small disorder. And so the marshal, half horseman and half master of ceremonies, held a wide and dusty kingdom that smelled of leather, straw, and wood smoke alike. Turn now to a gentler office, narrower but no less proud, the small wet dominion of the ewer, the keeper of the household's water and washing. For there were no taps then, no warm pipe in the wall, and so every drop that touched a noble hand was carried, warmed, and poured by careful servants. The ewer's chief duty came before and after every meal, when he brought the basin and the ewer, so that diners might rinse their fingers between dishes. You must remember that forks were scarcely known, and hands did much of the eating, so clean fingers were not vanity but the plain courtesy of the table. He scented the water sometimes with herbs, with rosemary, or with crushed leaves, so the small ritual carried a faint green sweetness through the smoky hall. Ewerer kept the table linen too, the cloths and the towels, washing, drying, folding, and guarding them against the soot that settled on everything. Picture him at his quiet labor, warming water at a hearth, breathing the steam, his hands forever a little reddened from the cold and the wet. His was a small office, easy to overlook, yet the Lord noticed it sharply on any night the basin came late or the water came cold. Beside the ewer stood the pandler, master of the pantry, whose whole kingdom was bread, that plain and constant foundation of every medieval day. The very word pantry comes from the old word for bread, and the pantler's first care was the loaves, their counting, their keeping, and their cutting. You will recall that the trencher itself was often bread, a thick, stale slice that served as a plate and soaked the juices of the meal. The pantler chose and cut these trenchers, and saw the fresh loaves to the high table and the staler bread down to the lower benches and the door. He kept the napkins and the salt as well, and the knives for the bread, all gathered into his small, precise dominion of crust and crumb. And nothing was wasted, for the bread that had soaked the meal, the gravy-heavy trenchers were gathered up afterward and given as alms to the poor at the gate. So consider that even the leavings of a feast had their appointed officer and their appointed mercy, passing from the high table to the hungry at the door. Near the pantler, and often confused with him by the weary, stood the butler, whose narrow realm was the bottlery, the wine, the ale, and the cups. But it is to a quieter officer we now drift, the chandler, whose small dominion was the making and keeping of the castle's precious light. For light was not free then, nor cheap, nor easy, and the dark that fell on a castle was a deep and honest dark you can scarcely now imagine. The chandler made the candles, and there were two kinds, and the difference between them measured the whole quiet hierarchy of the house. For the Lord in the chapel there were candles of beeswax, clean burning, sweet smelling, pale and dear, the gentle aristocrats of flame. And for the rest of the house, for you and the kitchen and the passages, there was tallow, rendered from animal fat, smoky, guttering and faintly rank. Picture the chandler at his pots, dipping wicks again and again into the warm fat, building each candle in patient layers like the rings of a small tree. He tended the lamps as well, the little oil lamps and the crescents, and he counted the stubs and the savings, for even light was something to be hoarded. His kingdom was warm and close and smelled forever of fat and smoke, and his fingers, like the ewers, were never wholly clean of his trade. Yet think how he ruled, in his humble way, the very edges of the night, deciding how far the darkness might come before a flame was lit against it. And when the candles were doused at last, the house surrendered to a blackness so complete that you would lie still and listen to the breathing dark. Above all these small masters, binding their kingdoms loosely together, stood the steward, the great officer of the household's order and accounts. He held the tallies, the rolls, the reckonings, and answered to the Lord for every loaf, every candlestub, every measure of wine that came and went. Beneath him these offices interlocked like gears, the chamberlain and marshal, the ewer and pantler and chandler, each turning the others quietly along. And you, somewhere low among them, belonged to one of these little dominions, your day shaped by which master's keys hung nearest to your hand. For there was comfort in it too, you must understand, in knowing your office, your master, your task, and the narrow bounds of what was asked of you. The marshal would never ask you to mend a candle, nor the chandler to saddle a horse, and in that division lay a strange and steadying peace. Each office had its own small pride as well, the ewer in his bright basin, the pantler in his even loaves, the chandler in a clean and steady flame. And each had its small dreads, the late water, the burnt bread, the guttering wick, little failures that loomed enormous within their narrow walls. So the great castle, which from the road looked like one proud stone fist against the sky, was within a patient quilt of small and overlapping kingdoms. Each officer a little lord of bread, or water, or light, or horses, ruling a realm no wider than a pantry yet tended with a real and human care. And tonight, when you reach without thinking for the switch beside your bed, remember the chandler who once stood between a whole household and the dark. Remember the ewer who warmed the water that you now summon with a turn of the wrist, and the pantler who counted out the bread you take for granted. Their small dominions are long fallen now, their keys long rusted, their ledgers long crumbled, yet the comfort they tended still wraps quietly around you. So let these little masters keep their patient watch in your drifting thoughts, each at his post, each tending his small kindly corner of the dark. Now let us turn to the most intimate work of all, the keeping of the Lord's own chamber, where you tend the bed, the fire, and the close and private matters no other servant may touch. You are not the highest of the household, yet you stand nearer the Lord than the marshal or the steward ever will, for you see him asleep, which is a kind of trust. The chamber is small by your modern reckoning, stone-walled and cold, with one shuttered window and a single grey bed that swallows most of the floor. Imagine the linens, for they are the chief of your daily labour, the sheets of woven flax that must be smoothed, aired and turned with a kind of reverence. Linen is precious, spun and woven by patient hands, Wash thin over the ears until it is soft as river water against the skin of the grate. You strip the bed each morning, shaking out the sheets, beating the bolster, turning the great mattress so the down within it does not pack flat and lifeless. The mattress beneath the linen may be stuffed with feathers for a lord, or with straw and flock for those of lesser standing, and you know the difference by its weight. You air the linens at the window when the weather allows, for the chamber is close and damp, and stale cloth was thought to breathe the bad and heavy airs. Picture the bed dressed properly, the under sheet drawn tight, the upper sheet turned down, the coverlet of wool or fur laid over all, the curtains looped back by day. Those bed curtains are no mere ornament, but a wall of cloth against the draught and the cold drawn closed at night to make a small warm room within the room. In the morning you draw them open, and the chamber smells of wood smoke and tallow and the warm closeness of a body that slept the night within. You scatter sweet herbs among the linens, and within the chest lavender and woodruff and dried rose to keep the moth away and lend the cloth a kinder smell. The Lord's shirts and underlinen are yours to keep as well, fine soft cloth worn next to the skin, gathered for washing and laid back folded and clean. Washing such linen is not done in the chamber, but you carry it down to the laundress, who works it with lye and ash and a great deal of cold red-handed labor. Now we must speak, gently and without unease, of the chamber pot, for the Lord does not walk to the garderobe in the dark of a cold night. The pot is a plain vessel of earthenware or pewter, kept beneath the bed or behind a low screen, ready against the small hours when nature will not wait. In the grandest houses there is a close stool, a padded seat over a pot, a quiet dignity granted to the body's most ordinary and unavoidable needs. It is your task each morning and without complaint to carry the pot away, to empty it, to rinse it, and to return it clean and waiting beneath the bed. There is no shame in this work, only the plain truth that every body in every age has its needs, and someone in the great houses was paid to attend them. Consider, as you lie warm tonight, that your own waste vanishes at the press of a lever, silent and unthought of, a small wonder no medieval lord could dream of. The garderobe itself, a stone closet jutting from the wall with a seat above a shaft, drops down into a pit or the moat far below. You keep the garderobe seat wiped and the soft mosses or torn cloth replenished, for that was the gentle stuff that served before paper was a household thing. The pit beneath must be cleared in time by the gong farmer, a man of the foulest and best paid trade, who comes by night to do what no one else will. That is not your work, mercifully, and you are glad of it, for the chamber's small pot is burden enough for any one pair of willing hands. Now picture the private fire, the heart of the chamber, for a lord does not shiver as the common folk shiver in the dark of the year. You wake before the Lord in the grey and bitter cold, to rake the ashes, lay the kindling, and coax the flame back to life from the banked embers of the night. You learn the small craft of fire, the way the dry kindling must lie loose for the air, the way the larger log is fed in only once the flame stands sure. The wood is carried up by others, but you stack it neat beside the hearth, the seasoned logs for steady heat, the green ones left below to dry another year. At night you bank the fire, heaping ash over the glowing coals so they smoulder slow till morning, for to let it die was to begin the cold from nothing again. You tend the smoke too, for a chimney is a fine new thing, and many a chamber still let its smoke wander up to a louvre in the roof above. Where there is a proper hooded hearth set into the wall, you bless it quietly, for it draws the smoke away and leaves the air sweet and the eyes unstun. The light of the chamber is yours to keep as well, the candles trimmed, the wicks cut, the dripping wax scraped from the holders before it hardens grey. For the Lord you set out beeswax candles, pale and clean and sweet burning, kept for the great and saved from the common reek of the household tallow. Tallow rendered from mutton fat is what lights the lesser rooms, and it gutters and stinks and smokes, and you know its smell as you know your own hands. You carry the Lord a candle to light him to bed, and you wait and you snuff it when he bids you, plunging the chamber into the deeper dark. Imagine the hush of that moment, the small flame pinched out between dampened fingers, the smoke curling up, the warm dark settling over the sleeping great house. There is washing water to think of, for the ewer brings it, but in the chamber you set out the basin and the soft cloth for the Lord's hands and face. You pour the water, warmed if the season is cruel, and you hold the cloth, and you take it back, these being the small courtesies owed to the body of the great. By the bed you keep a small nightlight burning, a rush, dipped in fat or a low stub of tallow, so the chamber is never wholly without its flicker. For the Lord, as for the common folk, the night was kept in two halves, a first sleep and a second, parted by a waking hour in the deep of the dark. In that waking hour the Lord might pray, or muse, or call quietly for the pot, and you, dozing on a pallet near the door, must rise and answer. For you sleep here, on a truckle bed or a straw pallet on the floor, close enough to hear the Lord's voice, for a chamber servant is never truly off his duty. There is little privacy in this, and little for the Lord either, for the medieval great were rarely alone, attended even in their sleep by faithful watching servants. You learn the Lord's moods by the chamber, the restless nights, the early risings, the days he lingers abed, and you order your work to suit them all. You keep the clothes chest too, the great carved coffer where the Lord's good garments lie folded with herbs, the furs, the woolens, the fine cut cloth. You shake out the furs and hang the heavy gowns to air, brushing away the dust, watching always for the moth that would ruin a season's costly cloth in a night. The floor is yours to sweep, the old rushes gathered up and cast out when they grow foul, fresh rushes and herbs strewn down in their place. Picture the green of the new rushes underfoot, the bruised herbs releasing their scent as you walk, a small sweetness laid against the chamber's old stone shell. You guard the chamber door as well, admitting only those the Lord will see, turning back the rest with a soft word, for the chamber is the Lord's own quiet refuge. Here, in this small warm room, the Lord lays aside the great hall and its watching eyes, and here you alone attend him, and the trust of it is heavy and plain. You think sometimes, stacking the warm linen, that you sleep colder than your master, on a thinner bed, yet near a finer fire than any servant of the hall. And there is a strange closeness in it, for the man you serve is to the world a power, yet to you he is only a body that sleeps and wakes and needs. Consider, as your own warm room holds its even and unwatched heat, that this Lord's comfort cost a waking servant his sleep, his knees, his cold and early mornings. You carry the chamber's small smells with you, wood smoke in your hair, tallow on your fingers, the dry green of herbs caught in the weave of your sleeve. And when the fire is banked, and the candles snuffed, and the Lord breathing slow behind his curtains, you lie down at last in the dark, you have made warm. You listen for a while to the small sounds of the great house settling, the timbers easing, the wind at the shutter, the slow, soft breath behind the curtained bed. Let this thought carry you gently onward, that the warmth around you now was once a labor someone rose in the cold dark to make, and need not be made by you. Now let us turn to the strangest little room in the whole castle, the one tucked into the thick stone wall, the place we politely call the garde-robe. You, who reach in the dark for a clean tiled room with a soft light and warm water at the turn of a tap, can scarcely picture how it was. The word garde-robe means, charmingly, a place to guard your robes, for folk believed the rising odour kept the moths from gnawing their good wool. So the privy and the wardrobe were often one and the same. The family's best cloaks hung in the very draught of the latrine shaft. Picture the seat itself, a smooth board of oak or elm worn pale by years of patient use, with a single round hole cut clean through. Beneath that hole ran a chute through the wall's heart, a vertical shaft of cold masonry dropping down into the dark below. In the kindest castles the shaft emptied into the moat, in others onto a midden heap, in a few simply down the outer wall itself. You can imagine the long stain upon the stones outside, a dark weeping streak that no rain ever quite washed away. Within, the chamber was scarcely larger than the seat, a niche of cold stone where the wind whistled up the shaft and chilled you to the bone. There was no porcelain, no chain to pull, only the simple physics of gravity and the patient cold of the open air. For wiping there was no soft paper, but instead a handful of hay, a wisp of moss, or a scrap of warm linen kept in a little pot. The grander folk might keep a bundle of soft tow or lamb's wool, while the rest may do with whatever leaf or rag came to hand. Now here is the question we have been circling, the quiet question, which is who on earth had to keep this place fit to use? For a shaft, however cleverly cut, does not empty itself, and over the seasons the foot of it filled with all that gravity delivered. And so there was a man for it, a man of the very humblest rank, known plainly and without flattery as the gong farmer. The word gong was the old plain English for the privy and its leavings, and farmer here meant simply the one who gathered the crop. He came by night, you understand, for the work could only lawfully be done in the dark hours when the household lay abed. By the soft light of a single horn lantern, he would climb down to the foot of the shaft, or stand in the reeking midden below. With a long-handled scoop and a sturdy wooden bucket, he emptied the pit by hand, load by patient load, hour upon hour. You, who think nothing of the matter, may carry a small gratitude tonight for the unseen pipes that spare you ever knowing his trade. The gong farmer was paid well for so wretched a labour, far better than most servants, for few men would willingly take it on. But the coin came with a price, for the air down there was foul and heavy, and more than one such worker was overcome and lost. The leavings he gathered were not simply thrown away, for nothing in that careful age was wasted that might be turned to use. The night soil, as they called it, was carted off beyond the walls to be spread upon the fields and gardens as good rich manure. So the castle's waste fed the very cabbages and leeks that would return one day to the great hall's steaming pots of pottage. In the largest households, the chambermaids and the lower scullions shared in tending the upper privies, sweeping and scattering fresh herbs. They strewed the floor with sweet rushes and dried lavender and woodruff, a brave small effort against the stubborn truth of the place. A pot of ashes or lime stood ready by the seat, to be cast down the hole and soften, a little, the smell that rose from below. For the lord and lady there might be a cushioned seat, a velvet cover for the board, even a small brazier to warm the freezing stone. A body servant, the groom of the stool in the very greatest houses, attended even this most private moment of his master's day. It was, strange to say, a post of honor, for to be trusted in so intimate a duty meant you stood close to the Lord's own ear. You, sleeping alone behind a latched door tonight, may smile that privacy itself was once a privilege the great did not always want. The shafts were cunningly placed to share an outer wall, so that 2 or 3 privies might drop into a single common chute. This was tidy for the builder, yet it meant the cold draught carried sound and scent freely between the floors, sparing no one. Some clever masons set a little window or a cross-shaped slit beside the seat to let the worst of the air drift quietly out. And in the deep of winter, with snow heaping the battlements, that small open slit made the garde-robe a chamber of true and biting cold. You may picture a sleepy castle child of a night, candle guttering, hurrying through the cold passage on small bare feet to that bleak little room. For there were no privies near the beds, only this one shared niche in the wall, reached by cold stairs and colder corridors. By night, a chamber pot served instead, a vessel of pewter or glazed clay kept beneath the bed for the small hours. And it fell to a chambermaid each grey morning to carry that pot away, down the winding stair, to empty it down the garde-robe shaft. She did this for every chamber, every dawn, a quiet, unbroken round of work. No one thanked her for, and no song ever recorded. You, whose mornings begin with warm water and a turn of a handle, may grant her a moment's quiet thanks across the long centuries. The garde-robe could, on rare occasion, betray the whole castle, for a determined attacker might climb the very shaft to slip inside. It is said a castle once fell because an enemy found the privy chute unbarred and sent men creeping up through the dark. So the wiser builders set an iron grate across the outer mouth, guarding the keep even against this most undignified of doors. The cleaning of those iron bars, choked as they grew with the months, was yet another task for the gong farmer's long and patient scoop. Within the chamber, the stone walls grew slick and dark over the years, and these too were scrubbed now and then with sand and ash and lye. The wooden seat itself was scoured pale and smooth, and when at last it rotted, the castle carpenter cut and fitted a fresh board. All of this, the scooping and the scrubbing and the carrying, was done so quietly that the great folk above scarcely knew it happen. For that was the whole art of good service, to make the necessary vanish, to let the Lord believe the castle simply kept itself clean. And the men and maids who guarded that secret asked for little: a dry corner to sleep in, a bowl of pottage, a wage in copper coin. They are gone now, every gong farmer and every chambermaid, their names unwritten, their long nightly labours folded silently into the dark. Yet the thick walls still stand in their ruins, and high in the broken stone you may still find the little hole where the seat once was. So when you rise tonight, in your warm, clean room, with its soft light and its quiet water, spare a gentle thought for those patient hands. They kept the strange little room in the thick wall fit for use, asking nothing, remembered by no one, until now by you half asleep. Now let us turn gently to the matter of what actually filled a servant's belly, because the great hall feast you imagine were almost never the food that you yourself would eat. You wake before the light, and the first kindness of your day is not bread, but the slow grey warmth of pottage, simmering in a cauldron that is almost never allowed to go entirely cold. Pottage is the quiet hero of your life, a thick stew of oats or barley, beans, and whatever herbs and roots the garden has surrendered to the season. It is not glamorous, and it is rarely the same twice, since yesterday's leftovers and this morning's scraps are simply tipped back in to thicken tomorrow's portion. You carry a wooden bowl that is yours alone, worn smooth at the rim by your own thumb, and you guard it the way a modern person guards a favorite mug. There is bread, of course, but you must understand that bread in a castle is a ladder, and you stand somewhere near its lower rungs. The lord and his guests eat manchet, a fine white loaf of sifted wheat flour, pale and soft and faintly absurd in how much labor it costs to make. You, more often, are given the darker, heavier bread, the maslin of mixed wheat and rye, or coarser stuff still, dense enough to sit in the hand like a small stone. At the great table the diners eat their meat upon trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that serve as edible plates, soaking up grease and juices through the meal. And here is a small mercy that quietly shapes your evenings, for those gravy-soaked trenchers are not thrown away, but gathered up and given to the lower servants or to the poor at the gate. So your supper may well be the very plate the Lord dined upon, sodden now and rich with the memory of a meat you never tasted whole. Meat itself reaches you rarely, and in modest measure, for the best joints climb upward to the high table, while the trimmings, the offal, and the bones descend to you. You become of necessity a connoisseur of the humble cuts, the trotters and the cheeks, the tail and the tripe, the parts that the well-fed leave behind. On the great feast days, though, even you eat a little better, since custom and a lord's pride demand that the whole household be fed when the household celebrates. And on the many fasting days of the church, the whole castle turns to fish, so you eat salted herring and dried stockfish until the very smell becomes the smell of piety. Stockfish is cod dried hard as a board, and to make it edible you must beat it and soak it for days, a labor you perform without complaint because hunger is a patient teacher. Vegetables, which the great and grand affect to despise, are quietly your friends, the onions and leeks and cabbages and beans that the kitchen garden gives up in their seasons. You eat with the rhythm of the year, fresh and green in the warm months, and dried, salted and stored in the long, cold dark of winter. There is cheese, hard and sharp and made to last, the kind that a laboring person could carry in a pocket and gnaw at through a long afternoon. And butter and eggs appear when the season and the church permit, small richnesses that you learn to notice and quietly to treasure. Sweetness in your world comes mostly from honey, for sugar is a costly import locked away among the Lord's spices and reserved for his table alone. You may taste a fruit from the orchard, an apple or a pear or a handful of plums, sometimes fresh and more often dried into a chewy, concentrated sweetness. Now let us speak of drink, and here you must set aside everything the word ale conjures in your modern mind, because this is a different creature entirely. You drink ale not to be merry, but simply to be hydrated, since the water near a crowded castle is rarely to be trusted, and ale is brewed, and therefore safer. The strong ale, the good ale, is for the Lord and his guests, brewed full and kept mature, a drink of weight and warmth and consequence. What comes to you is small beer, also called weak ale, the second and third washings drawn from grain already brewed once for its betters. The good grain gives its strength to the first strong brew, and then the same mash is steeped again in fresh water to make this thinner, gentler drink. So your weak ale is barely intoxicating at all, a cloudy, faintly sweet, lightly sour liquid that you could drink all day and very nearly must. You drink it at breakfast, you drink it at noon, you drink it at supper, and a measured allowance of it is simply part of what your service is worth. It is in truth a kind of liquid bread, brewed from the same grains and carrying real nourishment, so that a thirsty servant is also, quietly, a fed one. The brewing is often the work of an alewife, a woman whose skill at the mash and the tun is genuinely respected, for bad ale could sour an entire household's days. There are no hops yet to keep it, not in these earlier centuries, so the ale will not last long and must be brewed fresh and often in a tireless rhythm. This is why the brewing never quite stops, a constant low background labor of soaking and boiling and straining that hums beneath the life of the castle. You learn the taste of ale slightly turned, faintly vinegary at the edge, and you drink it anyway, because to waste it would be a small offense against a careful house. Wine exists in this world, but it floats far above you, a precious thing shipped from distant vineyards and poured for the Lord and his honored guests. You might catch its scent as you carry a jug across the hall, sweet and strange and faintly forbidden, before you return to your own honest cup of small beer. Your portions, the bread and ale and pottage you receive, are not random charity, but a known allowance, an understood ration that goes with your particular place. The household measures and tallies its food with real care, for a great castle is a small economy, and to feed 20 or 50 mouths daily takes constant arithmetic. The man who guards the bread is the pantler, who keeps the pantry and the loaves under his anxious and honorable charge. The man who keeps the drink is the butler, master of the buttery, drawing the ale and the wine and answering for every barrel in his care. Between the pantry and the buttery, bread and drink flow out to the hall in an order so habitual that no one need think of it, and yet someone always does. You eat seated low, below the great salt cellar that marks the divide between those who matter at table and those who merely fill it. To sit below the salt is to know your place in a single glance, and you have known it so long that the knowledge no longer stings. Your meal is quick and unceremonious, eaten with a spoon and your fingers and a knife you carry yourself, for forks are not yet part of this world. You wipe the bowl clean with the last of your bread, because a clean bowl is a small daily virtue, and because leaving food behind is a thing you cannot imagine. In the lean weeks of late winter, before the new growth comes, the pottage thins and the bread grows coarser, and everyone simply tightens the belt a little. And in the years when the harvest fails, the whole arrangement trembles, for a castle can only share out what the surrounding land has managed to grow. But in an ordinary year, in an ordinary season, your food is plain and sufficient, monotonous and dependable, the quiet engine that keeps your tired body moving. You will not grow fat on it, and you will not go hungry on most days, and there is a strange and durable comfort in knowing exactly what supper will be. The grandest cookery of the castle, the roasted swans and the spiced pies and the subtleties moulded into sugared shapes, passes you by like weather you only hear about. You see those marvels only as labor, the plucking and the basting and the carrying, and almost never as a thing that arrives upon your own plate. And yet there is a fellowship in the lower meals, a bench crowded with people who share your hunger and your weariness, and the same grey, faithful pottage. You pass the ale jug down the line, and someone tells a small joke, and for a quarter of an hour the work is set aside, and the food is simply food. It is here, perhaps more than anywhere, that you taste the real flavour of the castle, not in its spices but in its plainness, shared. So when you next stand before a cold larder of endless choice, with clean water from a tap and ale brewed strong for pleasure rather than survival, you might think of this. Think of the worn wooden bowl, the dark bread, the cloudy small beer measured out by the cup, and the quiet, steady sufficiency of a servant's daily fare. Now let us turn gently to the rare and shining days of feasting, those scattered jewels in the long grey calendar that a castle servant lived quietly to reach. For most of the year your days were pottage and bread, and the same patient labour, and feast days arrived like small windows opening onto a warmer world. The medieval year was stitched together by the feasts of the church, by Christmas and Easter, and the long roll of saints' days that marked the turning seasons. You did not need a printed almanac to know them, for the bells told you, and the kitchen's sudden frenzy told you even louder than any bell. Christmas was the great one, the 12 days that ran from the Nativity onward, when even the lowest scullion might taste something better than his ordinary fare. The hall would be strewn with fresh rushes, sweetened with herbs, and greenery of holly and ivy was brought in from the cold to soften the bare stone. You, who carried the boughs and from the frost, breathed the green smell of them and felt, for a moment, that even you belonged to the celebration. In the kitchens the great fires were stoked higher than usual, and the air grew thick with the scent of roasting meat, the most of the year you only imagined. A boar's head might be carried in with ceremony, garnished and gilded, paraded the length of the hall, while the household watched in hungry wonder. There were swans and peacocks too on the very grandest tables, dressed again in their own feathers, so the birds seemed to sail living down the board. You will never plate a peacock in its plumage, and your modern feast comes warm from an oven. You simply switch on, a small marvel you rarely pause to thank. The marshal and the steward fussed over the seating, for at a feast more than ever rank was made visible in who sat near the salt and who below it. The great salt cellar stood like a little tower upon the high table, and to sit above it was honour, while below it sat the lesser folk in their cheerful crowd. You, of course, did not sit at all during the serving, for the feast that fed others was for you the longest working day of the entire bright season. The pantler brought out the finest bread, the ewer poured scented water for the washing of hands, and the cupbearer kept the Lord's goblet brimming. You moved between the tables with platters heavier than your arms preferred, your face arranged into the calm blankness that good service always required. The dishes came in waves, they called courses, each a small flotilla of meats and pies and subtleties, and between them you scarcely had a breath. The subtleties were the wonders of the feast, sculptures of sugar and marzipan and pastry, castles and beasts and saints built only to be admired and then devoured. You carried one such marvel once, perhaps a sugar tower taller than your 2 hands, and prayed quietly to every saint that you would not let it fall. Spices flowed at feasts as at no other time, the pepper and ginger and cinnamon and precious saffron that came from impossibly far across the known world. You smelled riches you would never own, the warm dust of cinnamon and the sharp bite of ginger, scents worth more by weight than the wage you would never see. And there was wine and ale brewed strong for the occasion, flowing more freely than caution, loosening the hall into laughter and song as the hours wore on. You poured for others far more than for yourself, though a kindly cellarer might let a measure find its way to the servants when the Lord's eye was elsewhere. For the music came too, and this perhaps was the gift that trickled furthest down, settling even upon the ears of the lowliest in the hall. Minstrels and travelling players arrived for the great feasts with harp and lute and pipe and tabor, filling the smoky air with sounds you heard at no other time. You did not need a fine seat to hear the music, for sound is generous and democratic, and it reached the doorway where you stood as fully as it reached the dais. A piper's tune or a singer's old ballad would catch in your chest, and for the length of a song the weight of the laden tray seemed a little lighter to bear. There were jugglers and tumblers and fools as well, turning and capering for the Lord's delight, and the laughter they raised washed over high and low alike. You, standing wearily by the wall, might let one true smile escape you at the antics, a smile no steward could begrudge on so loud and forgiving a night. The dancing came later, when the boards were cleared, the company rising to step the slow and stately measures the music had been quietly promising all evening. You cleared those very boards, of course, gathering the trenchers and the bones and the spilled cups, while above the dancing turned, but the tunes were yours to keep. And here we come to the scraps, the part of the feast that belonged most truly to you and to the poor who gathered hopeful at the castle gate. The trenchers themselves were a kind of plate, thick slabs of day-old bread that soaked up the juices and sauces through the long and dripping meal. When the feast was done, these sodden trencher-loaves, rich now with the fat of the Lord's own dishes, were gathered up and not in a careful house thrown away. They went into the alms basket, given to the poor who waited outside or shared among the servants, so that the Lord's gravy reached far below his own table. You might eat better on the night after a great feast than on any ordinary day, picking through the broken meats and the cooling pastries left behind. There was an office for this, the almoner, charged with the careful giving of leftovers, so that charity and thrift walked hand in hand from the high table downward. What could not be given fresh was kept, the cold meats finding their way into the next day's pies, for the medieval kitchen wasted very little that could be saved. You learned in this way the geography of a feast's afterlife, which dishes returned remade and which softened scraps were quietly yours before the dawn. Your own modern leftovers wait cold and bright in a humming box, claimed by no almoner, owed to no poor at the gate, a private plenty you forget is rare. Beyond Christmas there were other feasts that broke the year, Easter most of all, ending the long lean fast of Lent with eggs and meat and quiet rejoicing. Through Lent you had eaten no meat for many weeks, living on fish and beans in the patience of the season, so the Easter roast was a deliverance you felt in the body. There was Whitsun and Midsummer with its bonfires, and Michaelmas with its goose, and Martimas when the autumn beasts were salted down for the coming cold. Each of these tilted the kitchen into brief abundance, and each let a little of that abundance spill by scrap and song down to the hands that made it possible. There were the Lord's own days as well, a wedding in the family, the churching of a lady, the welcome of a great guest who must be honoured at the board. You could not know in advance when such a day might fall, but you knew its coming by the sudden ordering of extra beasts and the scrubbing of the second best plate. And at the very greatest houses the feast might spill outward into largesse, the Lord scattering small coins or bread among the gathered crowd to show his open hand. You watched such generosity with the practiced eye of one who knew its true cost, for you had carried every dish and would wash every cup it took to make it shine. Yet for all the labor, these days were the bright threads in the cloth of your year, the proof that even a hard life held its scattered mercies and its music. When at last the hall emptied and the fires sank to a red glow, you carried out the final scraps and stood a moment in the sudden, ringing quiet. The music still turned somewhere inside you, a half-remembered tune you would hum to yourself through the dull weeks until the next feast came round. You ate your share of cooling pie sitting on a kitchen bench, weary to the bone, yet warmed by spice and song in a way the ordinary days could never offer. And then you climbed at last to your straw and your shared blanket, full for once the harp's last notes fading as your tired eyes began to close. So when you next sit at your own warm table with music you summoned from the air and food kept fresh by quiet machines, perhaps you will think of them. Think of the servant standing by the wall, hungry and smiling, catching the fallen scraps and the borrowed tune, and grateful as you may be for so small a kindness. Now let us turn gently to the laundry, for of all the labours that filled a castle's week, few left so lasting a mark upon the body. You might imagine from your warm bed tonight that washing linen is a small thing, a quiet hum of a machine in another room. But in the medieval castle there was no machine, only water, ash, time, and the worn red hands of the woman they called the laundress. She was a servant of real standing in her small way, trusted with the Lord's body linen, his shirts, his sheets, his bands of fine cloth. For linen, you must understand, was the only cloth that touched the skin, worn beneath wool that itself was almost never washed at all. The wool kept its grease and its smell for years, but the linen shift was changed, and so the linen carried all the labor of cleanliness. So the laundress did not wash everything, but that was not the way. She washed the white things, the body things, again and again and again. And morning began before the kitchen smoke had cleared, hauling water by the bucketful from the well or the river that fed the castle. You turn it up and forget it, but she measured her day in buckets, each one heavier than the last as her arms began to ache. The water came cold from the ground, and the soiled linen came to her in baskets, and somewhere between the two stood the great mystery of soap. For true soap, the kind boiled hard with oil and lye, was costly, imported, a luxury more for fine faces than for an endless heap of sheets. So the laundress made her own cleansing power from the humblest thing in the castle, the cold grey ash left in every hearth each morning. She gathered the wood ash carefully, for ash from good hard wood gave the strongest virtue, and she would save it as a cook saves salt. Into a barrel with a false bottom of straw and twigs she packed the ash, and over it slowly she poured the cold well water. The water sank through the ash hour by hour, dissolving from it a sharp and bitter liquid, and this dark drip was the lye she needed. You may test such lye, the old wisdom said, by floating an egg or a feather, for if they sank the lye was yet too weak. It was, though she had no such word for it, a strong alkali, and it bitted grease and grime as nothing cold water alone could do. But the very strength that cleaned the linen so well had no kindness at all for the skin of the hands that wielded it. For lye does not know the difference between the dirt on a sheet and the soft, living skin of the woman holding that sheet. She would soak the dirtiest linen first in this lye, letting it stand and steep, the alkali loosening every stain of the long week. This long soaking they sometimes called the buck, the linen the buckwash, laid in a great tub or trough, lined and ready. Over the heaped cloth she laid a coarse sheet, and upon that sheet she spread fresh ash, and through it poured hot lye again and again. All day the hot lye would percolate down through the ash in the cloth and the linen, drawn off below, reheated, and poured once more. It was patient, circular, unhurried work, the same motion of pouring and draining repeated until the daylight thinned toward evening. And while the linen steeped, there was the river, or the trough, where the cloth must be rinsed and beaten clean of the loosened filth. She would carry the heavy, wet bundles down to the water, kneeling on the cold stone, plunging her arms into the elbow. There she used a beetle, a flat wooden bat, to pound the cloth against the stone, driving the dirt and the lye out together. You would hear that dull, rhythmic knocking carry across the water, the soft thud of wood on wet cloth, steady as a slow heartbeat. The cold of the river did its own quiet damage, for hands already raw from lye were now numbed and chapped by the chill. Between the bite of the alkali and the bite of the cold, the laundress's hands became a kind of map of her labor. The skin reddened first, then roughened, then split at the knuckles into small painful cracks that never quite had the time to heal. For there was no salve she could afford in plenty, perhaps a little tallow or goose grease rubbed in at night, and not much else. You reach for a bottle of lotion without a thought, but for her, soft hands was simply not a thing that this life allowed. And yet she carried those hands with a kind of unremarked dignity, for everyone knew the laundress by her chapped and reddened skin. It marked her trade as surely as flour marked the baker or soot marked the man who tended every smoking hearth in the hall. When at last the linen was beaten and rinsed and wrung, there came the spreading, the part of the work that asked for sun and air. She would carry the wet weight, heavier now than dry, out to a green slope or a hedge or a frame raised for the purpose. There the linen was laid flat upon the grass to bleach, for the sun and the dew together would whiten it more than any washing could. This bleaching on the grass had a name, the laundress's bleaching green, a stretch of meadow given over to drying cloth. She would damp the cloth again as it dried, turning it, watching it, for the slow alchemy of sun and water took patient days. And she watched it too against thieves, for clean linen drying in the open was a tempting thing, easily snatched and easily sold. There is something in that image to hold as you drift, a person sitting quietly in a field guarding nothing but clean white sheets. When the linen was dry and white and sweet, it was gathered, smoothed, and folded, and here too the work was not yet done. For there was the smoothing of it, with a heavy stone or a polished glass smoother, pressed and rubbed across the cloth on a board. Some used a slick stone of glass shaped like a mushroom, rubbing the dampened linen until it lay flat and faintly shining. And then the finest linen might be scented, laid among dried herbs, lavender or sweet woodruff, so the Lord's bed smelled of summer. You pull a clean sheet to your chin tonight, and the smell of it is a small machine's work, but hers was the work of days. From the cold ash of yesterday's fire to the sweet folded sheet, every step had passed through her two patient, reddened hands. And so she would do it all again, for the linen never stopped coming, the week turning over and the baskets filling once more. The Lord changed his shift, the household changed their sheets, and somewhere the laundress filled her buckets and gathered her ash. It is easy to pass over such a life as small, but consider how much of comfort rests on someone else's aching, cracking hands. She is one of the countless people whose names we will never know, who kept the castle clean and never sat upon its cushions. So when you settle now into linen washed by quiet machines, you might spare a kind thought for the laundress and her wood ash lie. Picture her hands, red and cracked and capable, drawing one more clean sheet from the grass, smoothing it flat against the fading light. Let that gentle, repeated labor carry you onward, the slow pour of lye, the soft thud of the beetle, the white cloth on the green. Now let us turn to the matter of light, and the small daily injustice of who in the castle was permitted to see clearly after dark. You, who reach for a switch on the wall and flood a room with steady brightness, can scarcely imagine how precious an uneven flame once was. In the Lord's chambers above you, the candles were beeswax, pale and clean burning, giving a bright, untroubled flame with very little smoke. Beeswax was costly, gathered from the hives of monasteries and manors, and so it marked the rooms of those who could afford to waste it. Its light was steady enough to read by, to sew fine seams by, to admire a tapestry by, and it perfumed the air faintly with honey. You may keep a beeswax candle yourself now, lit for pleasure on a winter evening, never thinking it once stood for rank itself. For you, far below stairs, there was no beeswax, and there was certainly no thought of wasting it on a servant's small errands. Your light, when you were granted any at all, was the tallow dip, made from rendered animal fat and the length of rushy wick. Tallow came from the kitchen's leavings, the fat of mutton and beef boiled down in great pots until it set into a pale, waxy mass. You dipped the wicks again and again into the warm fat, building each candle in thin, patient layers, a chore for the long, quiet afternoons. The result smoked and guttered and smelled frankly of the slaughtered animal it had been, a low, greasy odor that clung to the room. You learned to live with that smell as you learned to live with so much, until you no longer noticed it upon yourself. The humblest light of all was the rushlight, a simple peeled reed soaked in fat, burning fast and giving only a thin wavering gleam. You gathered the rushes yourself from the wet meadow in summer, peeling away most of the green skin and leaving one thin strip to hold the pith. Dried and drawn through hot grease, each rush would burn perhaps a quarter hour, tilted in its little iron holder like a frail glowing splinter. It was a light to cross a room by or to find your bed by, but never a light to truly do anything by. And so most of your evenings happened not in light at all, but in a darkness so complete that you have likely never met its equal. When you switch off a lamp at night, a soft glow still leaks beneath your door from a street, from a screen, from the world humming on. Your medieval night had no such mercy, for once the fires sank and the candles were doused, the dark was total and pressed close as cloth. You could hold your hand before your face and see nothing of it, only feel the air move as the fingers pass. In that darkness you moved by memory and by touch, counting steps along a wall you had learned by day with your fingertips. You knew the cold ring of an iron handle, the splintered edge of a particular door, the exact stair that sloped and would trip the unwary. Candles were not lit for comfort, but spent like coin, and a steward kept careful account of how many were used and by whom. To burn a light needlessly was waste, and waste in a great household was watched, noted, and quietly held against you. The chandler, The household's candlemaker ruled over this small economy of flame, rendering fat, drawing wicks, and storing the wax under lock. It was honest, greasy, smoky work, and if you served beneath him, your hands were forever slick and your sleeves forever marked. You carried the precious beeswax up the stairs to the Lord's rooms, and you carried your own poor tallow dip back down to the dark. And in that simple traffic of light, up and down, the whole order of the castle was written plainly for anyone who cared to read it. The Lord's hall blazed for a feast, with many candles ranked upon the table, and the warm, crowded brightness of it must have seemed a small miracle. You stood at the shadowed edge of that brightness, refilling cups and clearing plates, your own face half in light and half in the dark beyond. When the meal ended, the candles were snuffed and saved, and the splendid room sank back at once into the same darkness as everywhere else. Fire was spared as much as it was wanted, for a castle held wood, straw, cloth, and thatch, all of it eager to burn. So at night the great fires were raked down and covered, banked under ash to smoulder safely until the cold grey morning. This covering of the fire gave us a word you still half know, the curfew, from the French to cover the flame at the day's close. When the curfew bell rang across the town, fires were to be banked and lights put out, and the working day was declared finished. For you that bell was almost a kindness, the signal that no more could be asked of you, since nothing more could be seen to do. With the light gone and the fire covered, the castle did not lie idly waiting for dawn, but went to its bed in 2 parts. People then commonly slept in 2 stretches, a first sleep soon after dark and a second sleep before the dawn, with a waking hour between. In that strange wakeful hour, in the dead middle of the night, you lay in the dark and let your mind drift where it would. Some rose to mend a fire, to pray quietly, to murmur with a bedfellow, before sinking back into the second sleep until the grey hour. You, who lie in one long unbroken sleep, might find that older pattern uncanny, yet it suited a world ruled by darkness and not by clocks. Without light you could not read, nor sew, nor sort, nor do any of the close work that fills a modern evening so easily. So the dark hours were given over to talk, to song, to story told from memory, the voice carrying what the eye could no longer reach. Tales were passed mouth to mouth in that blackness, the same stories worn smooth by many tellings, the only entertainment that needed no flame. You learned the long hours of winter, especially when darkness fell in the late afternoon and did not lift until well after you had risen. In those months you woke in the dark, you worked into the dark, and the brief pale daylight between felt borrowed and quickly spent. Summer, by contrast, was generous, the long northern evenings letting you work and rest by the free, unbought light of a slow-setting sun. You learned to follow the sun as your master rather than the candle, rising with it, laboring through it, and yielding when it withdrew. The moon, too, was your ally, and a full moon over the bailey could turn a black courtyard into a place a careful foot might cross. You came to read the sky as a kind of lamp, knowing the moon's nights from the dark ones, and planning your errands around its mercy. And so your eyes, untroubled by any glare, grew keen in the gloom, finding shapes and edges where a modern eye would see only black. This is a small skill you have wholly lost, this seeing in near darkness, for you have never truly needed it and never truly been in the dark. Consider, as you settle now beneath your covers, the soft and constant light you command without thought, a luxury no medieval lord could buy. You need not rent a fat, nor peel a rush, nor count your candles against a steward's tally before daring to spend a little flame. The darkness that once swallowed your every evening is now a thing you choose, switched off and on at a fingertip's gentle pressure. So let the dark gather kindly around you tonight, knowing it is yours to dismiss whenever you wish, and was once a master no servant could refuse. And spare a calm and grateful thought for the one who once dipped tallow by guttering light and walked the black stairs home by memory and touch. Now let us turn to the matter of darkness, and how you, as a servant in that great stone house, learned to move through it without ever once being able to see. For the castle by night was a different country altogether, a place of utter blackness where the eyes you trusted by day became, quite suddenly, of no use to you at all. You must understand that light, real light, was costly, and no household burned good wax or even cheap tallow simply so that a servant might find the stairs. And so when the last hall fires were banked low and the great candles snuffed, the corridors did not merely dim, they vanished entirely into a thick and patient dark. You would wake in the small cold hours, perhaps summoned, perhaps merely needed, and step out into a black so complete that you could not see your own raised hand before your face. And yet you went because you were expected to go, and because over the months and years your body had quietly learned the whole shape of the place by heart. Your fingertips, you see, became your eyes, reading the cold and the damp of the walls the way a reader's fingers might one day read, raised dots upon a page. The stone told you things, for it was warmer near the chimneys and the kitchens, and colder, far colder, near the outer walls where the wind pressed in from the night. You learnt to count, not in numbers spoken aloud, but in steps taken, in the precise distance between one doorway and the next, measured 1,000 times until your feet simply knew. There were 13 paces, let us say, from the buttery door to the turn of the passage, and your legs remembered 13 even when your waking mind had wandered far away. And then the stairs, those treacherous spiraling stairs, climbing up inside the thickness of the wall in a tight and giddy turn of worn and uneven stone. Most such stairs wound up to the right as you climbed, and every tread was a different height, deliberately, so that no stranger could ever run up them in the dark. But you were no stranger, and so the very unevenness that betrayed an intruder became, for you, a kind of language written into the steps beneath your feet. Your hands sought the rope or the rough central pillar, the newel, worn smooth and pale by 100 years of climbing hands, reaching for it in just such a dark. You counted the turns as you rose, feeling the curve pull steadily leftward against your shoulder, and you knew without seeing when the landing was about to arrive. For the air changed at a landing, growing suddenly broader and stiller, and a draught would touch your cheek from some passage opening away into a deeper black. You read the draughts as a sailor reads the wind, knowing that this cold thread of air meant the great hall ahead, and that won the chill mouth of the garderobe. Smell, too, became a map you could not have drawn, but never lost, the sour sweet of the buttery, the smoke and grease that hung forever about the kitchen. You knew the green damp breath of the well stair, and the warm animal closeness of the stable wall, and the cold mineral nothing of bare untrodden stone. And there were sounds, always sounds, for a great stone house at night is never truly silent, but breathes and settles and ticks like a sleeping animal. You learned the particular creak of the third board outside the solar, and you stepped over it lightly, so as not to wake the family sleeping beyond the door. You knew the far-off boom of the great door in its frame when the wind rose, and the small dry skitter of mice that owned the dark as surely as you did. In time you could tell precisely where you stood by the echo of your own soft breath, by whether it returned to you flat and close or fled away into open space. A narrow passage held your breath near, gave it back at once, while the great hall swallowed every sound and answered only with a vast and patient hush. And so you walked, hand to the wall, foot testing each stone before it trusted its weight, in a slow and careful glide that disturbed neither sleeper nor dust. You held your other arm a little before you, not flailing, but gently, ready to meet the corner you already knew was coming 3 paces hence. For there is a particular fear in walking into stone you cannot see, and you have met that hard, cold edge enough times, early on, never to wish to meet it again. The newcomers, the green boys and the frightened girls, fresh from the village, gave themselves away each night by the bruises blooming upon their shins and brows. But you, who had served 3 winters or 30, moved through that blackness with the unhurried certainty of a fish moving through its own familiar pool. And on those rare nights when you did carry a light, a single tallow dip cupped against the draught, the small flame changed everything, and not for the better. For the flame drew a tight gold circle about your feet and pressed the surrounding dark into something thicker and blacker still, just beyond its trembling edge. Your own shadow leapt and swung about the walls as you moved, monstrous and unfaithful, so that many a servant trusted memory over so treacherous a friend. The flame had also to be guarded with a careful hand, for a drop light among the floor rushes was a terror no household ever quite stopped dreading. And so often you let it go, pinched it out, and trusted instead the older sense, the one that needed no fuel and cast no betraying shadow upon the wall. There were thresholds you learned to feel for with your toes, a worn dip in the stone where 10,000 feet had crossed before yours ever did. That gentle hollow told you, sure as any spoken word, that the chapel lay to your left and the long cold passage to the kitchen straight on ahead. Doorways, too, had their own character beneath the fingers, this one a low arch you must duck beneath, that one studded with great cold nail-heads of iron. You knew the latch of the buttery from the latch of the pantry by their weight and their click, and your thumb found each in the dark without a moment's fumbling. And how strange it is to think of you who reach now in your warm room and touch a small switch, and the whole night is banished in an instant without thought. You need not count your steps to the door, nor read the draught upon your cheek, nor fear the hard unseen corner, waiting patiently in the black. But they did, those servants, every single night, and they grew so skilled at it that the darkness ceased, in the end, to be an enemy at all. It became instead a kind of companion, a quiet element they swam through nightly, knowing its currents and its corners as well as they knew their own 2 hands. Indeed, there were those who said they preferred the dark, who moved more freely without the fickle candle, who trusted their feet far above their fretful eyes. For the eyes, by day, are forever doubting and second-guessing, but the feet, once taught, simply know, and they do not argue with the path before them. You came to trust your own remembered body, the way you trusted little else in that uncertain age, and the trust was earned stone by stone, night by night. There was the long gallery, where the floor sloped a hand's breadth toward the window, settled so by age, and your hip learned the tilt and corrected for it unbidden. There was the place where the passage narrowed so that 2 could not pass, and you would call softly into the black to learn if any soul were coming the other way. A murmured word, a name returned out of the blackness, and you both knew at once who waited and who must give way against the cold wall. It was a courtesy of the dark, this calling and answering, a small kindness traded between those who shared the long unlit nights of the great house. And when at last you reached your errand, the hearth to be tended, the chamber pot to be carried, the early fire to be coaxed, your hands knew their work blind. You found the embers by their faint and failing warmth, fed them by feel with the dry kindling you had set ready the evening before, and breathed them back to life. And in that first small bloom of flame, the corridor you had crossed, all unseeing, was at last revealed, ordinary and known, exactly as your feet had told you it would be. So let us be grateful, you and I, for the quiet light that comes at a touch, and let us spare a slow and kindly thought for those who walked the dark by heart. They carried no torch and feared no corner, those patient night walkers of the old stone houses, who made of utter blackness a place they knew as well as home. And as your own eyes grow heavy now, you might imagine that slow shore glide along the wall, hand to cold stone, foot finding its remembered place in the dark. Now let us turn, gently, to the matter of being unwell in a castle where everyone slept close together, and no doctor was ever truly within reach. You must understand that the servants of a great household did not sleep alone, tucked behind a door of their own, as you so quietly do tonight. You slept in the hall or in some passage near the kitchen, packed against your fellows for warmth, breathing the same close and smoky air until dawn. And so when one body fell sick, the sickness did not stay politely within that one body, but drifted, unseen, into every chest in the room. The people of that age did not know of the tiny living things we now blame, and so they reasoned instead with the learning they had inherited. They held that the body was governed by 4 humours, the blood and the phlegm and the 2 biles, yellow and black, kept in a delicate balance. Health, to them, was that balance held steady, and sickness was that balance overthrown by chill, by damp, by grief, or by foul and corrupted air. This bad air they called miasma, a thick and stinking vapour rising from filth and standing water and rot, and they feared it with good reason. For in a castle the smells were many, and the air was rarely clean, and the place where so many bodies lived together was rarely without some odour of decay. You, who can open a window tonight, or turn a quiet dial to summon clean warm air, would scarcely know how to breathe in such a room. When the common sicknesses came, as they came every winter, they passed from pallet to pallet like a rumour, swift and certain, and impossible to scold away. There were fevers that left a body shaking under its blanket, and agues that returned on their own grim schedule every 3rd or 4th day without fail. They were fluxes of the belly that emptied a person of all strength, brought on by tainted water or meat kept a day too long in the warm larder. And there were the coughs of the cold months that rattled in a dozen chests at once, until the whole sleeping hall seemed to breathe as one labouring thing. You will not be surprised to learn that no physician hurried to attend a sick scullion, for physicians were costly men, and their hours belonged to the great. A learned physician served the lord, the lady, perhaps the steward, and was summoned from afar at no small expense, and rarely soon enough to matter. He would study the patient's water in a tall glass, holding it to the light, judging its colour and its cloudiness as if reading a private letter. He might feel the pulse, and consult the position of the stars, for the heavens too were thought to press upon the humours and tilt them toward sickness. And his great remedy, more often than not, was to let some blood, opening a vein to draw off the excess he believed had thrown the body out of true. But the scullion, the spit boy, the laundress with the racking cough, these had no such visitor, and were left to the older and humbler arts of the house. For below the physician stood the surgeon, a man of the hands rather than the books, who set bones and lanced swellings and stitched the wounds of the careless. And below him still stood the people who actually nursed the sick, which is to say, the women of the household, the old wives, and whoever was kind enough to stay. It was these women who knew the herbs, gathered in their season and dried in the rafters, and brewed into the bitter little comforts of the cottage and the keep. They had a tea of feverfew for the aching head, and a syrup of horehound for the chest, and the bruised leaves of comfrey for the swollen and broken limb. They had honey for the throat, that golden and ancient cure, and willow bark steeped in water for the fever, though they knew not why the willow eased the pain. Some of their cures were sound, and some were merely hopeful, and some were sheer charm and prayer. A saint's name murmured over a fevered brow in the dark. For when medicine failed, as it so often did, there remained the older comfort of faith, and the sick were carried, when they could be, toward the chapel. You will find this strange, perhaps, but consider how little else they had. No clear cause to fight, no certain cure to give, only their care and their hope. And so the sick servant lay where he had always lain, in the crowded hall, while the well stepped around him and slept, of necessity, an arm's length away. There was no separate room for the unwell in most households, no quiet ward with a closing door, only the same straw and the same shared and breathing dock. If the sickness was a small one, it ran its course, and the body rose again in a day or three, weak and grateful and back at its work by the week's end. But you must remember that this was an age in which a small sickness could quietly become a large one, with no one able to tell which was which until the end. A cut that festered, a fever that would not break, a cough that sank deeper into the chest each night, any of these might carry a strong young body away. And the household, having no power to prevent it, learned a certain gentle fatalism, a habit of grief held quietly, that we, with our hospitals, can scarcely imagine. Yet do not picture them as careless of the sick, for they were not, and the duty of care fell upon the household as surely as the duty of bread. Someone always carried the broth, thin and warm, made with whatever the kitchen could spare, for a sick body was thought to need feeding back into balance. Someone kept the fire near the sufferer, for warmth was held to drive out the cold humours, and the chill was thought to deepen any sickness it could reach. Someone changed the soiled straw and washed the linen in the great steaming tubs and aired the heavy blankets when at last the sun consented to appear. For cleanliness, in their own fashion they did pursue, sweeping the rushes, scattering sweet herbs to mend the air, scrubbing the boards with sand and ash. They scattered lavender and rosemary and meadowsweet where the sick lay, believing that sweet smells could push back the foul air that they so feared. And in this, strange to say, they were not entirely wrong, for the clean room and the swept floor did by accident keep some sicknesses at bay. Now and then, into this quiet round of small sicknesses, there came a greater one, a thing that swept through not one household, but a whole grieving land. You will know of which I speak, the great mortality that crossed the sea and came inland in the years around the middle of the 14th century. They called it the Great Pestilence, or the Great Dying, and they did not know its cause, and blamed the corrupted air, the very miasma they so dreaded. They burned sweet woods and aromatic herbs in the hope of cleansing the air, and carried posies of flowers and stopped their mouths against the stench. In a castle where so many lived so close, such a sickness, when it entered, found the crowded hall a ready and a willing road from one body to the next. And there was little the household could do but tend its own, and pray, and wait, and wash the days, and keep the fires, and bury the dead with care. It is a heavy thing to speak of as you drift towards sleep, and so let us not linger there, but draw the thread gently back to the smaller and daily truth. Most sickness in the castle was not the great dying, but the ordinary winter cold, the strained back, the bad belly, the fever that came and passed. And most of those who fell ill rose again, mended by broth and rest and rough kind nursing, and went back to the spit and the tub and the well. For the body of a working person was a hardy thing, used to cold and labour and want, and it knew, often, how to heal itself, if only given a little time. And the household, for all its lack of doctors, was not without its wisdom, the slow inherited knowledge of which herb, which broth, which word of comfort. So when you settle now beneath your own clean blanket, in your own quiet room, with the door shut soft against the cold, let the thought rest gently on you, that you may be ill, should illness come, in a room of your own, with help a word away, and clean air and quiet, and no crowded hall to share your fever. The servants of the castle never knew such ease, and tended one another as best they could, in the close warm dark, with patient and unrecorded kindness. So let us remember them kindly, those unnamed nurses of the sleeping hall, who carried the broth and kept the fire and asked no thanks for any of it. Now let us turn, gently, to the small matter of what you actually owned, you who scrubbed and carried and slept beneath another man's roof. It was not much, and that is rather the point, for nearly everything around you in the castle belonged to someone whose name you spoke softly. The walls were the lord's, the tables were the lord's. The very rushes strewn across the floor had been bought with a lord's coin. And so the handful of things that were genuinely yours took on a quiet weight, a significance far beyond their plain appearance. Chief among them, almost certainly, was the clothing on your back, which in your case meant rather more than a single change of dress. Many of your garments were not bought at all, but given, the cast-off livery of the household, handed down when finer folk grew tired of them. A worn tunic of coarse wool, a hood, a pair of hose, perhaps a cloak too thin for the winters you endured without complaint. You mended these things yourself, by firelight, with a needle you guarded as carefully as any treasure, for a needle was no small thing to own. Iron needles were made one at a time by hand, and to lose yours was to lose an evening's wage, so you kept it close and counted it often. You might have wrapped it with a length of wax thread inside a scrap of leather, and tucked the whole small parcel somewhere only you knew. For there was, you understood very well, no lock upon your sleeping place, and a household is a crowded thing, full of tired and hungry hands. Your knife came next, and very likely it mattered more to you than anything else he carried through the long working day. A medieval table set few knives for guests, because each person was simply expected to bring their own, drawn from their own belt. So your knife served at supper and at labour both, cutting your bread, your cheese, your cord, your leather, whatever the day demanded of it. You sharpened it on a stone, You oiled it against the rust that crept through every damp stone corridor, and you wore it always at your hip. To be parted from your knife was to be oddly naked, unready, and so it hung from your belt even as you slept, within a hand's easy reach. And the belt itself, that plain strip of leather about your waist, was quietly one of the most useful objects you possessed. For a servant's clothes had few pockets, or none at all, and so the belt became your shelf, your purse, your hook for the whole working day. From it you hung a small drawstring purse perhaps, holding a coin or two, a flint and needle, the very small sum of your portable wealth. That coin was hard won and rarely spent, kept instead against some imagined day of need that in your wisdom you knew would surely come. You might have carried a comb of bone or boxwood, narrow-toothed, less for vanity than for the small and patient war against lice. Such combs were common and cheap, and yet yours was yours, marked perhaps by a chip you knew by touch in the dark. A spoon, too, very likely of horn or of crudely turned wood, since metal spoons belonged to tables far grander than the one you served. You ate your pottage from a shared bowl or a hollowed bread trencher, but the spoon that carried it to your lips was your own. These were humble things, and yet consider how completely they made up the furniture of a life, the whole inventory of a working soul. You owned a blanket, perhaps, or a single coarse covering, though even that was sometimes the household's, and not truly your own at all. For your bed was rarely a bed in any sense you would now recognize, but a sack of straw upon the floor, shared with whoever slept beside you. You slept in the hall sometimes, on benches or among the rushes near the dying fire, where warmth was a thing to be quietly competed for. And so a warm covering became a real possession, guarded against the cold and against the cold hands of others come the deep of night. You might own a small wooden cup or a leather jack for ale, marked on its base with a scratch only you could read. A pair of shoes, if you were fortunate, of turned leather, soft-soled, soaked through by autumn and stiff as boards by the frosts of December. You greased them with tallow to keep the wet at bay, and when they wore through, you walked the cold floors barefoot until new ones could be found. And shoes, being slow to make and dear to buy, were guarded most of all, set carefully beside you as you lay down at night. Perhaps you owned a single object of small beauty, a saint's badge of cheap pewter bought at a shrine on some half-remembered holy day. You wore it on your hood or your cap, a flat little token of a place you had walked to once, footsore and full of belief. It promised protection on the road and luck in the day's labor, and it cost so little, and it meant, somehow, so very much. A wooden rosary, perhaps, or a string of plain beads, counted through your fingers in the dark when sleep was slow to come. These small devotions cost nothing and were yours entirely, the one private kingdom no steward could inventory and no lord could claim. If you could read, which you very likely could not, you owned no books, for a single book was worth more than years of your service. So your possessions stayed small and portable, the belongings of a person who might, at any season, be sent on or moved or simply let go. And this, perhaps, is the quiet truth of it, that you owned little because you owned little certainty of staying anywhere for long. What you had, you could carry on your back and at your belt and walk out the gate with, should the world turn against you. There was no chest of drawers, no cupboard of your own, only that small battered box if you were lucky, or a sack, or a knotted cloth. And into that box went everything, the spare hose, the comb, the needle, the saved coin, the whole sum of a careful and frugal life. You kept it where you could see it, and you knew, without counting, the very moment anything within it had been disturbed. For theft among the household was a real and constant worry, and the loss of a knife or a coin was a wound to a small economy. Yet there was also a rough honesty in such close quarters, where everyone knew everyone, and a thief had nowhere at all to hide. So your guarding was less a fear and more a habit, a quiet daily tending of the few things that proved you were a person at all. Each evening you might lay your things out, the knife, the spoon, the comb, in the same order, the way one tends a small and private shrine. And in the laying out of them there was a kind of peace, an ordering of the world that you and only you controlled entirely. For the great castle ran on someone else's command, but this small square of cloth and its contents answered to you and to no one else. You guarded little, and you owned little, and yet within that littleness you held something the Lord above you did not always possess. You held the rare and steadying comfort of knowing exactly what was yours, and exactly where it lay, down to the smallest worn and faithful thing. And tonight, beneath a roof you need not guard, with belongings you need never count, you may let those small careful hands of the past finally rest. Now let us turn gently to the close of the long working day, when the light has thinned and the great house begins, at last, to fold itself shut around you. You have been awake, in all likelihood, since before the dawn, when the chandler's tallow stubs were still guttering in their iron cressets along the wall. The hours since have run together into one long ribbon of fetching and carrying, of scouring pots and turning spits and answering the small impatient bells of your betters. Your arms ache in that particular dull way that a body learns to carry without complaint, because complaint, you have found, changes nothing about the work. And now the evening meal is done, the trestle tables wiped and stacked, the broken meats gathered into baskets for the alms that will go to the poor at the gate. You have helped the Ewer carry away the basins and the long linen towels with which the household washed their hands before and after they ate. The pantler has counted his loaves and locked the bread away, and the butler has closed the buttery where the ale and wine are kept against the night. You have watched, half enviously, as the lord and lady withdrew to their solar, that warm inner chamber where the family sit apart from the noise of the hall. There they have a proper bed, you know, a great curtained frame with a feather mattress, hung about with woolen drapes to keep the draughts and the prying world outside. You will not sleep there, of course. Your rest is humbler, arranged among the embers and the benches and the quiet corners that the great folk never think about. But there is a particular sweetness you find in this hour when the orders stop, when no further voice calls your name across the smoky air. The fire in the central hearth has been banked down now, the bright logs raked apart and the ash drawn carefully over the embers to keep them living until morning. This is a small nightly craft of its own, this banking of the fire, for to let it die means the long cold labor of striking flint and steel again at dawn. For the embers are tended like something half alive, coaxed and covered, set to slumber beneath their soft grey coverlet so that they may wake when you do. And around that warm and breathing heart of the house, the servants begin, one by one, to settle themselves down for the night. You drag your pallet of straw a little nearer the hearth than is strictly your due, because the nights are long and the stone of the floor drinks the warmth out of a body. The straw is changed, not nearly so often as one might wish, and it has a smell, a close and earthy smell, that you have long since ceased to truly notice. You loosen your belt. Ease off your shoes if you are fortunate enough to own a pair, and lie down still, mostly dressed, for your clothes are your blanket too. A rolled cloak becomes a pillow. A second cloak, if you are lucky in your station, becomes the cover drawn up to your chin against the seeping dark. The household does not undress and slip between cool sheets the way you do. You who lie now in the safe and curtained comfort of a modern bed. They sleep in their shirts and shifts, in the warmth of the day's own linen, in the company of one another, for there is little privacy and even less heat to spare. Around you the great hall is emptied of its daylight purpose and become a vast shared bedchamber, the floor a country of sleeping bodies and gentle breathing. The marshal of the hall sees the last lamps doused, the doors barred, the dogs let in to lie warm among the rushes and to growl at whatever moves in the dark. Those dogs are no mere pets, but part of the quiet machinery of the night, ears pricked even in sleep, the household's first soft warning against the unfamiliar. You listen as you drift to the small architecture of sounds that means the house is safe, the settling timbers, the wind at the shutters, a single dog's sigh. Somewhere above, a watchman or a porter may be wakeful upon the walls, but down here, among the warm ash, your duties have finally and truly ceased. There is a tallow lamp left burning low near the door, its small flame swimming in its fat, a single point of orange wakefulness in the wide, dark room. You know the smell of that burning tallow, as you know the back of your own hand, that thick and animal scent so unlike the clean sweetness of the chapel's beeswax. For beeswax is dear and reserved for the altar and the Lord's own table, while you and your kind make do, always, with the humbler light of rendered fat. And yet the tallow light is enough, just to see by should the Lord call for something in the night, or should a child of the household wake and weep. For your rest, even now, is not entirely your own. The night bell may yet ring, and a chamberlain may yet need a hand, and you will rise without question if it does. But for the moment no bell rings, and the great house holds its breath, and the cold beyond the walls presses close, and is kept, for now, at bay. You think, perhaps, in the loose and wandering way of a tired mind, of your home and your people, of the village you left to take your place in this stone household. You think of the bread you carried, the floors you swept, the small kindness of the cook who slipped you the burnt heel of a loaf when no one was watching. These are the riches of a servant's day, the unrecorded mercies, the warm corner by the fire, the full belly, the roof that does not leak above your head. And then, in the manner of your age, you do not so much fall asleep all at once as slip into the first of two distinct slumbers that the night will hold. For this is the time of the first sleep, that deep and early plunge into rest that begins not long after dark and runs until the small hours of the morning. You will wake, as nearly everyone wakes, somewhere in the black middle of the night, in that quiet hollow between the first sleep and the second. And this waking is no cause for alarm, no sign of a troubled mind, but simply the natural shape of a night before clocks and bright lamps rearranged are sleeping. In that wakeful hollow you might whisper a prayer, or tend the fire, or murmur a few words to another who lies awake nearby in the warm and patient dark. Some, they say, use that quiet hour to think, to pray, to make peace with the day behind and the day ahead, before sinking down into the second sleep. You, more likely, simply shift your weight upon the straw, draw the cloak a little tighter, listen to the breathing of the house, and let your eyes fall shut again. The cold has crept a little nearer while you dozed, and you edge once more toward the embers, for warmth at night is a thing worth waking to chase. You bank your own small fire of body heat beneath the wool, and the second sleep comes upon you softer than the first, slower and shallower and kind. Outside the walls the true night reigns, the night your modern hours have all but abolished, a darkness without street lamp or screen or any glow but moon and star. It is a darkness you have learned, over the seasons, not to fear, for you know its sounds, its owls and its winds, its long settling of the patient stones. And the household sleeps in its layers, the lord warm in his curtained bed, the upper servants on their pallets nearer the chambers, the lowest of you by the hall fire. Each according to his place, each in the warmth his station allows, the whole great body of the house gone still, and breathing as one slow creature. There is, you may admit, a strange companionship in it, this sleeping all together, this shared keeping of one another through the long and undivided night. No one here lies wholly alone, as so many lie alone now, and there is a comfort in the nearness of other breathing souls that the dark cannot quite reach. The lamp at the door burns lower still, its little flame leaning and recovering, until at last it is only a bead of orange in the black. And you by now are far beyond the reach of any bell, sunk deep into the second sleep, your aching arms forgotten, your day at last entirely behind you. The dogs sleep, the timbers settle, the ash glows on, and the cold keeps its distance beyond the thick and faithful walls that hold you safe till morning. And in only a few short hours the dawn will come, and the bell will ring, and the whole weary machinery of the day will turn over and begin again. But that is the morning's business, and the morning is not yet, and you are not asked just now to think of it at all. For now there is only the warm grey breath of the embers, the soft weight of the cloak, the slow tide of sleeping breath rising and falling all around you. And so the long day folds quietly shut, and the great house dreams its stone-walled dream, and the night carries everyone, lord and scullion alike, gently down. Now let us turn, gently, to the people you would never have noticed, the forgotten invisible hands the castle truly ran on while the lord took all the credit. You imagine a castle and you picture a knight or a lady at a high window, but the building did not run on knights, it ran on tired people you cannot name. For every armored man on a horse, there were dozens of quieter souls, scrubbing, hauling, mending, and stirring, and almost none of them appear in the chronicles you might read. So picture yourself stepping into that household, not as the lord, but as one of the small folk whose whole world was the work that kept everyone else warm and fed. You would have a place, a precise rung on a long ladder, for the medieval household was nothing if not a careful order of who served whom and when. At the very bottom, doing the work nobody else would touch, was the scullion, the boy or girl who scoured the greasy pots until their hands cracked. You would crouch by the scullery trough in cold water, scraping burnt pottage from the bottom of vast cooking pots, your fingers raw long before the day was done. The pottage itself, that thick simmering stew of oats, peas, leeks, and whatever the garden gave, fed the whole household and never quite left the kitchen fire. Above you stood the cook, a figure of real and shouting power, who ruled the kitchen like a small kingdom of heat, smoke, and constant knives. The kitchen was the loudest, hottest heart of the castle, and you would learn its rhythm by the bell, the fire, and the cook's impatient voice. Turning that spit was its own miserable craft, for someone had to crouch by the flames for hours, slowly rotating the roasting meat so it would not char on one side. You would sit there half-roasted yourself, face scorched and back curled, learning why the spit boy was pitied even by the scullion below him. Then there was the ewerer, whose gentle-sounding name hid a great deal of carrying, for he kept the household in clean water and fresh linen for washing. Before a meal, you would move along the high table with a ewer and basin, pouring scented water over the diner's fingers, since forks were rare and hands did the eating. The pantler ruled the pantry, guarding the bread, and in a world where bread was life, the keeper of the loaves carried a quiet importance. You would slice and shape that bread, and the oldest loaves, gone hard and flat, became the trenchers, the edible plates that soaked up the gravy of the rich. After the feast, those gravy-soaked trenchers were gathered up, not wasted, but given as alms to the poor, who waited hopefully at the castle gate. The butler, whose name still survives in our houses, kept the buttery, which despite its name held not butter but the barrels of ale and wine. You would draw the ale carefully, for almost everyone drank it daily, the weak small beer being far safer than the murky water from the well. Somewhere in the shadows worked the chandler, the maker and keeper of candles, and his work decided whether your evening had light at all. The fine households burned beeswax, sweet and clean, while you and the rest of the servants made do with tallow candles of rendered animal fat that smoked and stank. When your tallow stub gutted out, your day was simply over and you slept, because there was no cheap way to buy back the lost daylight. Above all these stood the marshal and the chamberlain, the senior servants who were less labourers than managers of the labour of everyone below. The marshal kept order in the hall and minded the horses and the lodging of guests, a man whose frown could rearrange your entire wretched day. The chamberlain looked after the lord's private chambers, his clothes, his bedding, and his money, a trusted intimate who slept near his master's door. And among the humblest of all the chamber servants was the one nobody envied, the groom of the stall, who attended the lord at the garderobe. The garderobe itself was a cold stone privy built into the thick wall, its shaft dropping down into a pit or a moat far below. You might think such a post beneath dignity, yet in time the man closest to the lord's most private moments often became the most quietly trusted of all. Spare a thought, too, for the chambermaids and laundresses, whose endless washing kept a household clothed and at least a little free of vermin. You would scrub the linen with lye and wood ash in cold troughs of water, your knuckles split by the work, your back bent over the wash all day. The household ate in the great hall in a careful order, the best food going up to the high table and the plainer fare flowing down to you. You would carry the heavy dishes from the kitchen along draughty passages, holding them high through the smoke and the press of bodies. The hall floor was strewn with rushes, fresh-cut reeds laid down to soak up the spills, the bones, and the worst things dropped during a long meal. You would sweep out the old soured rushes and lay the new, and a careful chamber might mix in herbs to soften the smell of so many living together. At night the hall did not empty, for the lower servants often slept right there on the rush-strewn floor, close to the warmth of the dying hall fire. You would not have a room of your own, nor a bed that was only yours, but you would have the embers, and the company, and the relief of lying down. And here, in that warm dark, many would wake in the deep of the night for what they simply called the first sleep and the second. for people then slept in two stretches, waking for a quiet hour around midnight to tend the fire, murmur, or pray, before sinking back into the second sleep. You would rise long before the household stirred, for the fires had to be coaxed back to life and the water hauled before anyone of rank opened their eyes. There was no privacy to speak of, no hour that was truly yours, for you served at the convenience of others from the first bell to the last guttering candle. And yet the work, however hard, came with shelter, with daily bread and ale, and with a roof over your head when the world outside offered little of any. For the poorest in the countryside, a place in a great household was a kind of security, hard and humbling, but warmer than a draughty hovel of your own. You learned a trade, too, of a sort, for the boy turning the spit might rise to cook, and the page might one day wear a knight's spurs. The household was a ladder, and though most never climbed far, the dream of climbing was real enough to keep tired hands moving. You would come to know every cold corner of the castle, every drip in the cellar, every loose stone in the spiral stair, better than the Lord ever did. It was the servants, after all, who truly lived in the building, while the Lord might be away for months chasing war, court, or his scattered estates. In his absence you kept the place breathing, airing the rooms, guarding the stores, and holding the slow daily life together until the great man returned. The seasons ruled your labor as much as any master, for autumn meant the slaughter and salting that would carry the household through the lean winter. You would pack the meat in salt against the dark months, smoke the fish, and store the apples in straw, for winter forgave no household that failed to prepare. And when sickness came, as in the great plague of the 1340s, the servants were no safer than their masters, often a good deal less. People then blamed bad air, the miasma, a foul vapor they believed rose from filth and rot, and so they burned herbs and fled the stricken towns. You would have understood little of why so many died, only that the work still had to be done, the fires still lit, the few who remained still fed. Through all of it, the plagues and the feasts, the cold mornings and the smoke, the household ran on hands that history did not bother to name. So when you picture a medieval castle now, let your eye drift away from the high table and down toward the steam, the rushes, and the embers. There, in the warm dark below the Lord's notice, were the people who truly kept the great cold building alive, one quiet, aching, unrecorded day at a time. And tonight, as you settle into a bed that is wholly your own, in a room that is wholly yours, you might spare them one last, drowsy, grateful thought. Picture them once more, the people who kept this castle breathing, the scullion with his cracked red hands, the chandler counting tallow against the dark, all of them long since dust. What looks to us like cruelty was, more often than not, simple fear wearing the mask of necessity, the fear of cold, of hunger, of the fever that took the strong and the weak alike. They were not a duller, harder species than you, but people exactly as you are, who loved their children, dreaded the winter, and laughed at jokes we will never get to hear. They slept their first sleep, and their second, woke in the deep middle hours, to murmur and to pray, and longed, as you do now, for nothing grander than to be warm and unafraid. And so let them rest, these forgotten keepers of a forgotten house, given back at last the small dignity of being remembered gently by a stranger many centuries from their own. Now come slowly back from that cold stone world, away from the smoke and the rushes and the endless climbing of dark stairs, back across all those quiet 100 years to here. You are not on a straw pallet in a draughty hole, but in your own bed, in your own warm room, where the heat does not depend on a fire that someone must rise to feed. No bell will wake you before dawn to haul water or scour pots. No frost waits on the floor, and the long dark outside your window asks absolutely nothing of you tonight. So let your shoulders soften and your hands grow still, and feel, just for a moment, a quiet gratitude for the simple, unremarkable comfort of a safe and silent bed. The castle is dark now, the fire is banked, and every weary soul within it has been laid down to rest, and so, at last, may you sleep well.